My parents handed my sister $1 million for her dream wedding and looked me in the eye, saying I did not deserve a single dime of help. So I walked away and cut all contact. 3 years later, my sister drove past my $3 million estate in Bethesda and called our mother sobbing because she could not understand how the family failure had built an empire. Subscribe if you know toxic people. I am Aaliyah, and I am 32 years old. I stood in the grand marble foyer of my parents' Potomac Maryland mansion feeling like a stranger in the very house where I grew up. The crystal chandelier overhead cast a harsh light on the imported Italian tile, reflecting the cold perfection that my mother Valerie and my father Roland valued above all else. They were the epitome of success in our affluent community. They attended all the right galas, belonged to the most exclusive country clubs, and expected their daughters to be flawless extensions of their carefully curated social image. I had never fit that mold. While my parents expected me to become a corporate lawyer or a specialized surgeon, I wanted to build something of my own. I had poured my entire life savings and every ounce of my energy into a commercial real estate startup. For 2 years, I worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificing sleep, relationships, and any semblance of a personal life to make my dream a reality. And it was working beautifully until my business partner forged my signature, emptied our operating accounts, and fled the state. The police were involved, but the legal process was agonizingly slow. I was left holding the bag. I had exactly 48 hours before the bank foreclosed on my commercial lease, and my vendors pushed me into involuntary bankruptcy. I needed a $50,000 bridge loan to keep my company alive. It was a drop in the bucket for my parents, but asking them for help was the hardest thing I had ever done. I tightened my grip on the manila folder containing my financial projections and walked into the formal living room. My mother was seated on the custom velvet sofa, sipping Earl Grey tea from a bone china cup. She wore a pristine silk blouse, and her hair was styled immaculately, as if she were expecting a magazine photographer rather than her eldest daughter. My father stood near the mahogany fireplace, checking his luxury watch. They both looked up as I entered, and the immediate shift in their expressions from relaxed to rigidly judgmental made my stomach churn. I took a deep breath and laid the folder on the glass coffee table. Mom, Dad, I need to ask you for a favor. A massive favor. I kept my voice steady, refusing to let my desperation show. My business partner defrauded the company I am facing. Immediate eviction from my commercial space and potential bankruptcy. If I cannot cover the vendor payments by Friday, I need a short-term bridge loan of $50,000. I have outlined my repayment plan right here with interest. I just need a lifeline to survive this quarter. The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sound in the massive room was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. My father did not even glance at the folder. He just crossed his arms and looked at me with an expression of profound disappointment. My mother carefully set her teacup down on the matching saucer. The delicate clink of porcelain against porcelain sounded like a gavel dropping in a quiet courtroom. Aaliyah, my mother said, her voice dripping with a condescension that I had known my entire life. We warned you about this. We told you that running off to play real estate mogul was a ridiculous fantasy. You had a guaranteed spot at a prestigious law school. You could have joined a respectable firm. You could have been someone we could be proud to introduce to our friends. Instead, you chose this chaotic, unstable path, and now you want us to bail you out of your own poor decisions. I felt the familiar sting of her harsh words, but I pushed forward. Mom, this was not a poor business decision. It was a crime committed against me. My business model is solid. The projections in that folder show exactly how quickly the company will rebound once the stolen funds are legally recovered. I just need temporary help to keep the doors open. I am your daughter. I am begging you to just look at the numbers and see the truth. My father finally spoke, his tone laced with absolute finality. Numbers do not matter when the foundation is rotten. Aaliyah, real success requires pedigree, stability, and the right associations. You chose to associate with a fraudster. You chose to gamble your future on a pipe dream. We worked too hard to build our wealth and our standing in this community to throw $50,000 at a sinking ship. It is simply a bad investment. I looked back and forth between them, trying to reconcile the people in front of me with the concept of family. They had just spent twice that amount remodeling a kitchen that was already perfect just to impress their country club friends. They had the financial means to save my life, work without even noticing the money was gone. But they were actively choosing to watch me drown. So you are just going to let me lose everything, I asked, my voice finally cracking under the immense weight of their rejection. You are going to let me go bankrupt over a tiny fraction of what you spend on summer vacations. My mother picked up her tea again, her posture rigid and unforgiving. She looked me dead in the eye and delivered the words that would ultimately kill any remaining love I had for her. She said, "You need to learn that actions have consequences. If you lose everything, then maybe you will finally wake up and realize you are not cut out for this world. We do not reward failure in this house, Aaliyah. We do not throw money out the window for reckless mistakes. You chose the wrong path, and now you must walk it entirely alone. You do not deserve any help." The very cruel words hung heavily in the air, sharp and suffocating. You do not deserve any help. I stood completely paralyzed, my lungs suddenly forgetting how to pull in oxygen. I had anticipated a harsh lecture. I had prepared myself mentally for a heavy dose of condescension and endless told-you-so remarks. But I had fundamentally believed that when pushed to the absolute brink, when looking directly into the terrified eyes of their own child, a mother and father would instinctively reach out. I was catastrophically wrong. Valerie did not flinch. She did not break eye contact. Her gaze remained as perfectly polished and unyielding as the imported marble floor beneath my feet. I searched her face desperately for a single flicker of maternal instinct, for a microscopic ounce of empathy, but all I found was a calculated emptiness. To her, I was not a daughter facing the terrifying destruction of her livelihood. I was a failed social experiment. I watched her slowly bring the delicate teacup back to her lips, taking a measured, deliberate sip, as if she had simply commented on the overcast weather, rather than delivering a death sentence to my future. The sheer normalcy of her movements was the absolute cruelest part of the entire exchange. It meant my devastation was routine to her. It meant my impending ruin did not even warrant a slight disruption to her morning tea ritual. My hands trembled so violently that I had to clasp them together in front of me, digging my fingernails deeply into my own palms just to stay grounded and keep from collapsing. Before I could even find the breath to defend myself, Roland stepped forward from the shadows of the fireplace. If I had foolishly harbored a tiny fraction of hope that my father might step in to play the mediator, he crushed it under his heel before I could even formulate the thought. He buttoned his tailored suit jacket, a harsh physical gesture of closing himself off from me, and looked down his nose with an expression of pure, unadulterated disdain. "Your mother is absolutely right," he stated, his voice booming across the cavernous room, echoing off the high ceilings. "We are thoroughly exhausted by your constant need to play the rebel Aaliyah. Do you have any idea how incredibly exhausting it is for us to explain you to our peers? We sit at elite dinners in Potomac, surrounded by senators, federal judges, and powerful corporate titans. Their children are securing partnerships at prestigious law firms or completing their medical residencies at top-tier hospitals. And then there is you, the black sheep, the rogue element who insists on embarrassing this family at every conceivable turn." He began to pace the length of the expensive Persian rug, his frustration visibly mounting with every aggressive step. "You could not just take the easy path we laid out for you. You had to go off and play real estate mogul in a cutthroat industry without our guidance or blessing. You deliberately chose to ignore our advice, and now that your little house of cards is spectacularly collapsing, you want to drag our checkbook down with you into the mud. We have spent decades meticulously building an impeccable reputation in Washington. Our name actually means something in this town. It means untouchable stability. It means elite success. Your current situation is a massive liability to everything we represent. If word gets out that our eldest daughter is being sued for commercial eviction or filing for bankruptcy because she was foolish enough to get scammed by a cheap street hustler, we become the laughingstock of our entire social circle. He stopped pacing and pointed a rigid, commanding finger directly at my chest. You have brought this entirely upon yourself through your own stubborn arrogance. You are a dark stain on the legacy I have built from absolutely nothing. Giving you $50,000 would not be helping you. It would be directly endorsing a spectacular failure, and we simply do not fund failure in this family. I stood rooted in the center of that opulent room, absorbing the brutal, suffocating reality of their words. They were not angry about my pain or worried about my survival. They were solely annoyed by the terrible inconvenience of my existence. The heavy silence that followed his brutal speech was not the kind of silence that invites a response or a desperate plea for mercy. It was a thick, toxic blanket, deliberately meant to smother any remaining fight I had left inside me. I looked around the lavish space, truly seeing it for what it was, for the very first time. The priceless original art, hanging on the walls, the custom silk draperies, framing the massive windows, the antique vases that cost significantly more than the bridge loan I was desperately begging for. This house was a hollow museum dedicated entirely to their vanity, and I was the ugly, flawed artifact they desperately wanted to lock away in the dark basement where no one could ever see it. I did not scream. I did not cry. The hot tears that had been burning the backs of my eyes just moments ago completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollow void rapidly expanding in the center of my chest. I felt a fundamental permanent shift within my own soul. The desperate approval-seeking daughter inside me took her final trembling breath and quietly died right there on that pristine Italian marble floor. The realization was profound and utterly terrifying. I was completely and entirely alone in the hard world. I had no safety net to catch me. I had no family to fall back on when the ground crumbled beneath my feet. The people who gave me life would rather watch me lose my apartment, my company, and my dignity than part with a microscopic fraction of their hoarded wealth, simply because my failure offended their delicate social sensibilities. They did not love me. They only loved the idea of a flawless daughter who made them look good in front of their wealthy friends. I was forced to stand there in the crushing silence, swallowing the bitter, toxic ash of their ultimate betrayal. I had come to them seeking a bridge over troubled water, and they had proudly set the bridge on fire while watching me drown. The suffocating silence in the room was suddenly broken by the sound of light footsteps echoing down the grand marble staircase behind me. I did not have to turn around to know who was descending from the upper level of the mansion. The delicate clicking of designer heels and the heavy, confident thud of leather loafers announced the arrival of my younger sister Jasmine and her fiancé Preston. They glided into the formal living room like royalty making an appearance before their subjects. Jasmine was 29 years old, but she still carried herself with the spoiled entitlement of a toddler who had never been told no. She was draped in a silk lounge set, looking effortlessly radiant and perfectly polished. She was the undeniable golden child of the family, the one who had followed every single rule my parents had laid out for her. She went to the right schools, joined the right sororities, and most importantly to my parents, she had secured a ring from a man they deemed worthy of our family name. He was 34 years old, a tall white man with sharp features and an aura of unearned arrogance that preceded him wherever he went. He belonged to a family in Boston that my parents constantly whispered about with deep reverence. They were supposedly old-money political heavyweights with a lineage that stretched back generations. My parents viewed him not just as a future son-in-law, but as the ultimate prize, a golden ticket that would finally elevate their social status from mere new wealth to an established dynasty. Preston walked into the room with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his expensive slacks. He looked at me standing there with my desperate financial projections still laying on the glass coffee table, and a look of sheer amusement washed over his face. He did not greet me as a future sister-in-law. He did not even offer a basic nod of acknowledgement. Instead, he looked me up and down, taking in my wrinkled blazer and the dark circles under my eyes. He snapped his fingers casually in my direction and muttered that I should tell the housekeeper to bring his usual sparkling water to the patio. He spoke to me with the casual disregard one might use for an incompetent servant who had forgotten their duties. He knew exactly who I was, but treating me like the hired help was his favorite way of asserting dominance in a house that did not even belong to him yet. I expected my parents to correct him or at least offer a mild reprimand for his blatant disrespect, but the transformation in my mother and father was immediate and sickening. The cold, unyielding masks they had worn while watching my life fall apart completely vanished. My father, the same man who had just finished screaming at me for being an exhausting burden, suddenly beamed with a warm and eager smile. He clapped his hands together and walked past me as if I were completely invisible, closing the distance to greet Preston with a hearty pat on the shoulder. My mother actually stood up from her velvet sofa, her face lighting up with genuine affection as she pulled Jasmine into a tight, loving embrace. The contrast was so sharp and so deeply violent that it made my chest physically ache. "Good morning, you two," my father said, his voice completely devoid of the booming anger he had used on me just moments ago. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a long rectangular piece of paper. He held it between his fingers with a look of immense pride, as if he were holding a winning lottery ticket. "Your mother and I were just finalizing some things with our wealth manager this morning, and we decided we simply could not wait another day to give you your present." Jasmine let out a high-pitched squeal of delight and rushed over to pluck the paper from my father's hands. I stood absolutely frozen in place, watching the scene unfold in slow motion. Jasmine stared at the piece of paper and her eyes widened in pure ecstasy. She threw her arms around my father's neck and then rushed to hug my mother, jumping up and down like a child on Christmas morning. Preston sauntered over and peered over her shoulder at the paper, giving a slow, approving nod, as if my parents had finally met a minimum requirement he had set for them. It was a bank check. My father had just handed my younger sister a check for $980,000. I could not breathe. The air in the room felt thick and heavy, like liquid concrete filling my lungs. $980,000, nearly $1 million handed over on a random weekday morning with a bright smile and a pat on the back. Just 10 minutes ago, I had begged them on my hands and knees for a $50,000 bridge loan just to keep myself from being evicted and pushed into bankruptcy. They had told me they did not have money to throw out the window. They had told me I did not deserve a single dime of help because I was a failure. And yet here they were, casually handing my sister a sum of money that was 20 times larger than the lifeline I needed to survive. "What is this for?" Jasmine asked, her voice breathless with excitement, though her greedy smile made it clear she already knew exactly what it was for. My mother walked over and smoothed a stray hair from Jasmine's perfectly styled head. "It is for your dream wedding, my sweet girl," my mother said, her voice dripping with an indulgent sweetness that made me want to be sick. "We want you to have the absolute best of everything. We want the floral arrangements imported directly from Holland. We want the custom designer gown you saw in Paris. We want the most exclusive venue in the entire city." My father nodded vigorously in agreement, stepping up to stand beside Preston. "We have to do this right," Roland added, turning to smile obsequiously at his future son-in-law. Preston's family comes from a long line of incredibly distinguished Boston politicians. Their pedigree is impeccable, and their social circle includes some of the most influential people in the country. When his family and their friends travel down here for this wedding, we must ensure that the event matches their standard of living. We have to show them that our family operates on the exact same level of wealth and sophistication. This $980,000 is an investment in our family's unified future. We simply cannot spare any expense when it comes to matching the pedigree of Preston's heritage. Preston offered a thin, arrogant smile and tucked the check into his own pocket without even asking Jasmine for permission. "It is very generous of you," Roland Preston said, his tone carrying a subtle hint of condescension. "My mother has very particular tastes, and she was quite concerned about the logistics of a Southern wedding. This will certainly help ease her mind and ensure the aesthetics are up to par. I stood mere feet away, completely shattered. I listened to my mother claim that handing over $1 million for a single day of partying was a necessary investment to impress a group of snobby strangers from Massachusetts. They were willing to drain a massive portion of their liquid assets just to prove their worth to Preston's white affluent family. They were willing to finance a lavish spectacle of imported flowers and champagne towers to buy the approval of a man who could not even be bothered to greet me by my name. The sheer hypocrisy was a physical blow. I had asked for $50,000 to save a legitimate commercial real estate business. I had provided them with a folder full of detailed repayment plans and verified financial projections. I had asked for a temporary bridge loan to survive a crisis caused by a criminal act. They had called me a reckless failure and a black sheep who embarrassed the family name. But when Jasmine wanted $1 million to throw a party and feed her fiancé's massive ego, they opened their checkbook without a single moment of hesitation. I looked at my mother, who was busy discussing the merits of flying in a private chef from Italy for the reception. I looked at my father, who was eagerly listening to Preston talk about his preferred brand of imported cigars. I looked at Jasmine, who was staring at the diamond on her finger with a vacant, satisfied smile. None of them were looking at me. They had already forgotten I was in the room. My crisis, my impending bankruptcy, my utter devastation did not even register as a minor distraction in the face of their wedding planning. My presence there was completely irrelevant. I was standing in a room full of people who shared my blood, but I had never felt more orphaned in my entire life. The realization hit me with a cold, terrifying clarity that washed away the last lingering traces of my desperation. They were never going to save me. They were never going to love me the way they loved Jasmine. They were entirely consumed by their desperate need for validation from Preston and his family. The disparity between my $50,000 plea for survival and her $980,000 gift for a wedding was the final undeniable proof that I meant absolutely nothing to them. The desperation that had brought me to their doorstep was gone, replaced by a profound icy numbness. The tears that had threatened to fall earlier were completely dried up. I did not feel sad anymore. I did not feel the crushing panic of my failing business. I just felt an overwhelming need to get as far away from these people as humanly possible. I watched Preston lean down and kiss Jasmine's cheek while my parents beamed with pride at the perfect picture they had purchased. They were a complete family unit, and I was nothing more than a ghost haunting their pristine foyer. I stood there in the center of the foyer, letting the brutal reality of the moment wash over me completely. Preston caught my eye over Jasmine's shoulder. He offered a slow, deliberate smirk, knowing exactly what was unfolding in front of him. He knew I was drowning, and he loved the fact that he was standing on the luxury yacht watching me go under. His arrogant expression was not just a passing glance, it was a calculated display of dominance. He was an outsider who had somehow managed to conquer my parents completely, and he reveled in the power he held over the biological daughter, who was currently begging for her life. Jasmine twirled around the marble floor, holding the imaginary wedding dress in her mind, her eyes glinting with a greedy, immense satisfaction. She did not even look at the manila folder I had placed on the coffee table. She did not care what was inside it or what kind of financial ruin I was facing. She only cared that she had won again. She had always needed me to be the loser so her victories could feel more profound. The absolute toxicity of the room felt like a crushing physical weight bearing down on my shoulders. I realized in that defining moment that my entire life had been a desperate, agonizing audition for a role I was never going to get. I had twisted my identity into impossible knots trying to be the perfect daughter, the smart businesswoman, the independent thinker who still made her family proud. But the horrifying truth was that they did not want me to be proud or successful. They wanted me to be a prop. I was the dark background they deliberately used to make Jasmine shine much brighter to their wealthy friends. My failure was not an embarrassment to them. It was a highly necessary feature of our twisted family dynamic. They desperately needed me to fail so they could feel benevolent and superior when they looked down on me from their pedestals. If I succeeded on my own terms, it would shatter their illusion of control and prove that their superficial values were completely worthless. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw the folder across the room or demand any sort of justice from the universe. Anger requires a certain level of hope that things can change, or that the people hurting you will finally understand your pain. And I had absolutely zero hope left for these people. The raging fire of betrayal that should have consumed me simply turned to a cold, hardened ice. I calmly reached deep into the pocket of my cheap blazer and pulled out the heavy brass key. It was the spare key to the mansion. My parents had ceremoniously given it to me when I graduated high school as a grand symbol that I would always have a home no matter where life took me. What an absolute joke that turned out to be. The key was nothing more than a leash, a reminder that I was allowed in their kingdom only if I played by their rules. I walked slowly toward the antique console table near the grand entryway. My footsteps made almost no sound on the imported Italian tile. The contrast between the loud, joyful celebration happening near the fireplace and my silent, deliberate exit was incredibly sharp. I stopped at the edge of the table and looked at the polished wood. I placed the key down flat. The heavy metal made a soft, definitive clink against the surface, sounding like a final period at the end of a long, miserable sentence. My father finally noticed my movement. He paused his enthusiastic conversation with Preston about imported cigars and frowned at me. His thick eyebrows drew together in a look of supreme annoyance. "What exactly are you doing, Aaliyah?" he asked, his tone dripping with impatience. "We are busy discussing the catering logistics for the wedding right now, so you can just let yourself out, and we will speak when you have fixed your attitude." I did not answer him. I did not owe him a single explanation for my actions. I did not owe any of them a single word for the rest of my natural life. I looked at the brass key sitting there on the table and felt an immense, overwhelming wave of physical relief wash through my body. The invisible chains that had bound me to their toxic expectations shattered into a million tiny pieces. The desperate child inside me, who just wanted her mother to love her, was officially gone, replaced by a woman who fully understood that survival required absolute ruthless detachment. I turned around and walked toward the massive double doors that led out to the driveway. Jasmine called out something behind me, probably a sarcastic remark about my wrinkled outfit or a fake condescending apology about my failing business. I did not process the words she spoke. Her voice was just meaningless, white noise fading into the background of my new reality. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped out into the crisp morning air of the Potomac neighborhood. The sun was shining brightly, casting long, dramatic shadows across the perfectly manicured driveway and the rows of expensive luxury cars parked out front. As I walked down the brick path toward my beat-up sedan, I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. My hands were no longer shaking. They were completely steady. I unlocked the screen and opened my contacts list. I found my mother's name nestled under favorites. I hit the block button and deleted the contact entirely. I found my father's name and did the exact same thing. Block and delete. I scrolled down to Jasmine and blocked her number without a single second of hesitation. I opened my email application and set up automatic filters to send any messages from their domains directly to the trash bin. I opened my social media accounts and unfriended and blocked every single member of my immediate family. I completely wiped their entire existence from my digital life before I even reached the door of my car. I got into my car and started the engine. They thought denying me help would break my spirit. They were wrong. My real life began today. The reality of my situation hit me the moment the adrenaline faded. I had exactly 48 hours before the eviction notices became legally binding. My landlord for my residential apartment was not as forgiving as I had hoped. By Wednesday afternoon, my bags were packed, and I was officially locked out of my home. I had to quickly move my few remaining personal belongings into my tiny rented commercial office space before the building manager locked those doors too. The office was no bigger than a walk-in closet located in a rundown building on the outskirts of the city. It had a single window that overlooked a brick wall and a heavy metal door that barely locked properly. That tiny, suffocating room became my entire world. I pushed my desk against the wall and made a makeshift bed on the floor using old moving blankets and my winter coats. The nights were incredibly cold, and the building shut off the central heating after 8 in the evening. I would lie awake shivering on the hard floor, listening to the sounds of traffic outside and the scuttling of mice in the ceiling panels. My diet consisted entirely of cheap, instant ramen noodles that I cooked using a small electric kettle I hid under my desk. I showered at a cheap 24-hour gym 2 blocks away, sneaking in before sunrise so no one would notice I was wearing the same corporate blazer 3 days in a row. My body was physically breaking down from the sheer exhaustion and lack of nutrition, but my mind had never been sharper. The devastating betrayal by my parents had completely burned away any lingering safety net I thought I had. There was no backup plan, there was no rescue boat coming to save me. It was just me, against the brutal reality of the commercial real estate market. I knew I had to pull off a miracle to survive. I spent 18 hours a day cold calling property owners, analyzing market trends, and hunting for distressed assets. I refused to use any of the affluent network my parents had built in Potomac. I wanted nothing to do with their money or their influence. I needed to build an empire that was entirely my own. My relentless grinding finally led me to a desperate seller in downtown Washington. He owned a massive prime commercial office building, but he had severely overleveraged his assets and was facing total foreclosure within 30 days. The banks were closing in on him, and he was terrified of losing his legacy. The property was worth millions, but he needed liquid cash immediately to avoid total ruin. I saw the perfect opportunity, but it was an incredibly risky play. I had absolutely zero capital to buy the building myself, but I had the market intelligence to know exactly who would want it. I spent the next week tracking down the representatives of a quiet foreign investment group looking to park a massive amount of cash in American real estate. They were highly secretive and very difficult to reach, but I was fighting for my literal survival. I managed to secure a 10-minute pitch with their lead acquisition manager. I walked into their luxurious boardroom wearing a blazer I had ironed on the floor of my office and shoes that were wearing thin at the soles. My stomach was empty, but I projected the absolute confidence of a seasoned real estate titan. I presented the desperate seller's building as an exclusive off-market opportunity. I mapped out the risk analysis, the projected revenue, and the long-term yield with flawless precision. The negotiations that followed were the most intense days of my entire life. I was acting as the sole broker between a seller who was panicking and a buyer who was extremely cautious. If the deal fell through, I would have absolutely nothing left, and the building manager would discover I was living in my office. I facilitated every inspection, handled every legal query, and smoothed over every moment of panic from both sides. I did not sleep for 4 straight days. I lived on black coffee and the pure burning desire to prove my family wrong. I constructed the deal structure so that my commission was built directly into the acquisition cost, ensuring the funds would clear immediately upon signing. On a rainy Tuesday morning 3 weeks before, I would have starved completely. The final contracts were signed. I sat in my freezing office staring at the cracked screen of my laptop, waiting for the bank notification. My hands shook so violently I could barely type in my password. Then the screen refreshed. The wire transfer had officially hit my business account. It was a 7-figure commission, a massive, unprecedented sum of money that completely changed the trajectory of my entire life. I stared at the glowing numbers on the screen and let out a breathless sob of pure relief. I was no longer a desperate woman sleeping under a desk. I was a millionaire. I had pulled myself out of the mud using only my own intellect and absolute sheer willpower. I transferred the funds into multiple secure accounts, immediately solidifying my new reality. Later that evening, as I sat in a warm hotel room eating my first real meal in months, I opened my laptop to review some legal documents. Out of habit, I checked the spam folder where I had routed all communications from my family. There were a handful of emails sitting there completely ignored. I clicked on one from my mother Valerie, just out of morbid curiosity. The subject line was about Jasmine's wedding preparations. The message was brief and dripping with the usual passive-aggressive poison. She wrote that it was a shame I was too stubborn to apologize, and that it was truly sad I could not afford a proper dress to attend my sister's luxury wedding. She mentioned that Preston had booked a private jet for their honeymoon, and she hoped I was doing okay in my little startup venture. Another email from Jasmine simply included a photo of her massive diamond ring with a caption about how blessed she was to have parents who truly supported her dreams. I looked at the emails and felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger, no sadness, no lingering desire to prove them wrong. Their superficial world of country clubs and inherited wealth seemed incredibly small and pathetic compared to the empire I was currently building from scratch. They thought I was rotting in the gutter, regretting my decision to walk away from their toxic kingdom. They had no idea that I had just brokered a deal larger than my father's entire annual portfolio. I highlighted every single email in the spam folder and clicked permanently delete. I watched their names vanish from the screen without a second thought. I closed my laptop and looked out the window at the glowing city skyline. The grind of year one had nearly killed me, but it had also forged me into something unbreakable. I was never going to look back again. My shadow empire was officially funded, and I was ready to take over the city. The transition from pure survival to calculated dominance happened quietly. The capital from that first massive commission was the seed that grew into my shadow empire. I did not buy a sports car or a flashy wardrobe to show off my new wealth. Instead, I hired the most discreet and expensive corporate attorneys in the district. I sat in a pristine glass conference room overlooking the Potomac River and mapped out a labyrinth of corporate structures. I officially founded my private equity firm, Apex Holdings, but my name appeared nowhere on the public registry. I layered the ownership behind a complex web of anonymous shell companies, limited liability corporations, and blind trusts registered in Delaware and Wyoming. I hired a front-facing managing director, a sharp man who answered only to me and acted as the public face of the company. To the outside world, Apex Holdings was just another aggressive institutional investor, flush with foreign and domestic capital. To me, it was a fortress. I was the unseen architect pulling every string from the shadows. I wanted absolute anonymity. I knew that if my family ever caught wind of my success, they would attempt to attach their name to it, or worse, try to tear it down. Remaining a ghost was my ultimate superpower. With the corporate veil firmly in place, I began my aggressive expansion across Washington, D.C. and Maryland. Year two was defined by a ruthless, calculated hunger. I targeted commercial real estate that other investors overlooked. I bought aging strip malls in up-and-coming neighborhoods, dilapidated office parks near government sectors, and mismanaged industrial warehouses. I used the cash from my first deal to leverage commercial loans, buying up properties at rock-bottom prices. My strategy was brutally efficient. I would acquire a distressed asset, quietly restructure the management, evict non-paying tenants, and completely renovate the spaces to attract high-paying corporate clients. The cash flow began to multiply at a staggering rate. One building turned into three turned into 10. My portfolio swelled, absorbing prime real estate across the metropolitan area. I was no longer begging for a $50,000 bridge loan. I was signing off on $50 million acquisitions before my morning coffee. I became one of the most powerful landlords in the region, yet not a single tenant knew my real name. I walked past my own properties, mixed in with the crowds on the sidewalk, completely unrecognized. I watched construction crews hang new signage on my commercial buildings while I sipped coffee from a paper cup on a park bench. The sheer scale of what I was building was staggering, but I kept my circle incredibly small. My wealth was entirely invisible to the naked eye. I lived a quiet, disciplined life, pouring every ounce of my energy into growing the balance sheet of Apex Holdings. While I was quietly cementing my status as a real estate titan, a very different financial reality was unfolding behind the gated walls of my parents' estate in Potomac. Valerie and Roland were desperately trying to maintain the dazzling illusion of their elite status. But the cracks were beginning to show. The $980,000 they had handed over for Jasmine's dream wedding had been the first domino to fall. What they never admitted to their country club friends was that their liquid assets were not nearly as vast as they pretended. They had drained their primary savings to pay for the imported flowers, the custom gowns, and the exorbitant catering needed to impress Preston's snobby Boston relatives. But the financial bleeding did not stop after the wedding reception ended. Jasmine and Preston had quickly become a pair of incredibly expensive parasites. Preston, despite his arrogant boasting and political pedigree, brought absolutely no money into the marriage. His family name was nothing more than a hollow shell hiding generational debt. He demanded the lifestyle of a billionaire, but refused to work for it, expecting my parents to foot the bill for his expensive tastes. Jasmine, having been pampered her entire life, saw nothing wrong with handing her father the bill for their luxury vacations, their country club dues, and the lease on her brand new Porsche. She treated her parents' bank accounts like a bottomless well, completely oblivious to the drought that was rapidly approaching. To keep the charade alive, my father began making desperate and reckless financial moves. Roland secretly took out a massive secondary mortgage on their Potomac mansion, hiding the paperwork from his social circle. He began quietly liquidating his retirement accounts just to keep the lights on and the champagne flowing at their weekly dinner parties. My mother Valerie was equally complicit in their financial suicide. She continued to max out high-limit credit cards to buy the latest designer collections, terrified that if she wore the same outfit twice, the other wealthy wives in her circle would smell blood in the water. They were drowning in compounding interest and secret debt, all to preserve a social standing that was entirely fake. The contrast between our lives was stark and poetic. Every time my father took out another high-interest loan to pay for Jasmine's superficial lifestyle, I was closing another cash deal on a commercial high-rise. Every time my mother swiped a credit card, she could not pay off to buy a purse to impress women who secretly hated her. I was quietly collecting rent from federal contractors and major retail chains. They were trading their actual wealth for the illusion of importance, while I was trading my anonymity for generation-defining wealth. My parents were bleeding out financially to please a son-in-law who secretly despised them, while I was building an empire that could buy and sell his entire fake legacy 100 times over. I had security teams brief me on market movements and competitor analysis, and occasionally I would have them run quiet background checks on the commercial landscape in my hometown. The data painted a clear picture of my parents' impending ruin. Their accounting firm was losing clients because my father was too distracted by his mounting debts to perform his duties. Their debt-to-income ratio was a ticking time bomb. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, terrified of the very society they had worshipped their entire lives. They had sacrificed their eldest daughter to protect their pride, and now that pride was eating them alive from the inside out. I sat in my penthouse office, watching the snow fall over the capital city, feeling a deep, profound peace. My shadow empire was growing stronger every single day, and I was completely untouched by the toxic collapse of the family I had left behind. Year 3 arrived not with a loud announcement, but with a silent, undeniable shift in gravity. The foundation I had poured during those first 24 months had completely solidified, and Apex Holdings was no longer just a rapidly growing firm. It was an absolute juggernaut. The commercial real estate market in the greater Washington area had bowed to my aggressive acquisition strategies. I was no longer a scrappy survivor hunting for scraps in the margins of the industry. I was the apex predator, making the market move to my rhythm. The revenue streams from my massive portfolio of renovated office parks, luxury retail spaces, and secure government leasing contracts flooded into my corporate accounts like a tidal wave. I was a multi-millionaire many times over. The numbers in my portfolio had grown so extraordinarily large, they almost lost their meaning, becoming just digital data points on a glowing screen. I owned entire city blocks. I owned the buildings where powerful politicians had their power lunches. I owned the very ground beneath the feet of the people my parents spent their entire lives trying to desperately impress. The irony was sharp and delicious. My mother and father were currently suffocating under the crushing weight of their fake elite status, while I was literally buying the very city they worshipped. But with massive generational wealth came the terrifying risk of exposure. I knew with absolute certainty that if my name ever leaked to the public, my parents would sense the money, like starving sharks smelling blood in the water. They would suddenly remember they had a daughter. They would demand their rightful share of my success. They would try to claim credit for my resilience, spinning a sick narrative about how their tough love had pushed me to greatness. I could not let that happen. I refused to let them taint a single dollar of the empire I had built with my own blood and sweat. To prevent this, I built a fortress of legal protection around myself that was completely impenetrable. I hired a top-tier legal and financial management team consisting of former federal prosecutors, ruthless wealth managers, and aggressive corporate sharks. They had one primary directive above all else, which was absolute total anonymity. They protected my money. They protected my name. They protected my peace. Every single transaction was deliberately routed through offshore accounts, blind trusts, and anonymous proxy board members. Anyone who worked for my firm or handled my personal affairs signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements with ruinous financial penalties for any breach of privacy. To the outside world, the mastermind behind the unstoppable force of Apex Holdings remained a total ghost. My legal team acted as a titanium shield, deflecting any curious financial journalists or aggressive competitors long before they could even get close to discovering my true identity. I paid my lawyers an absolute fortune, and it was the best investment I ever made. The shield gave me the ultimate luxury, which was complete and total freedom from the toxic reach of my biological family. They could not find me. They could not touch me. They could not destroy me ever again. As my empire reached its zenith and my security was firmly established, I realized I could no longer live out of suitcases and nondescript luxury rental apartments. I needed a sanctuary that reflected the powerful woman I had become. I began quietly scouting properties in Bethesda, Maryland, a highly exclusive affluent enclave known for its intense privacy and sprawling hidden estates. I did not want a stuffy, outdated colonial mansion like the one my parents owned in Potomac. Their house was a miserable museum of dead traditions and suffocating expectations. I wanted something entirely different. I found it at the end of a heavily wooded private drive tucked away from the prying eyes of the world. It was a stunning modern architectural masterpiece made of steel, sleek glass, and natural stone. It sat on 4 acres of pristine manicured land, surrounded by tall privacy hedges and a state-of-the-art security gate equipped with advanced surveillance. The house featured soaring 20-foot windows that let in massive amounts of natural light, creating a severe, beautiful contrast to the dark, oppressive shadows of my childhood home. It had an infinity pool that seemingly dropped off into the lush forest below a private screening room, and a chef-quality kitchen draped in imported dark marble. The asking price was exactly $3 million. I did not negotiate the price down. I did not apply for a jumbo mortgage. I did not ask for a single favor from a commercial bank or beg a loan officer to look at my projections. I simply instructed my primary wealth manager to wire the entire $3 million in pure, unadulterated cash through one of my holding companies. Purchasing a $3 million estate in cash was a feeling of raw, unfiltered power that completely rewired my brain. The closing process took less than a week. When the high-end real estate broker handed the heavy keys to my legal proxy, I was sitting in the back of my tinted SUV, just watching the massive iron gates of my new kingdom slowly open for the very first time. I walked through the massive glass doors of the Bethesda estate, and the profound silence of the house wrapped around me like a protective blanket. There were no screams about failure echoing down the halls. There were no snide, malicious remarks about my clothes or my career choices. There were no golden children parading their stolen wealth in my face while I drowned in debt. There was only space. Beautiful, quiet, incredibly expensive space. I walked through the massive living room, running my hands over the cool, smooth stone of the modern fireplace. I had bought my freedom. I had bought my sanctuary. I had bought my ultimate revenge without ever lifting a single finger against them. I hired a discreet private staff to maintain the property, including a groundskeeper and a personal security detail that monitored the perimeter 24 hours a day. My home was a fortress of solitude and success. I would sit on my expansive back deck in the evenings, sipping an expensive glass of wine while watching the sunset over the deep green canopy of the Bethesda woods. I was the undisputed queen of my own carefully constructed world. I had successfully completely isolated myself from the rot of my past. I had everything I could ever possibly want, and I had achieved it entirely on my own terms. Yet even as I sat in my $3 million fortress secured by the best lawyers money could buy, fate was quietly arranging a collision course. The universe has a funny way of testing the walls we build, and my carefully curated anonymity was about to intersect violently with the desperate collapsing world of the family I had left behind. While I was building an empire built on concrete assets and ruthless discipline, the world my parents had chosen over me was rotting from the inside out. The rot started with the very man they had worshipped as their ultimate social prize. Preston was not the old money Boston political royalty he claimed to be. The generational wealth of his family had completely dried up decades ago, squandered by bad investments, failed campaigns, and a desperate need to maintain their political image long after the funds were gone. By the time Preston came along, his family was nothing but a hollow name attached to a mountain of hidden debt and crumbling historic properties they could no longer afford to maintain. He was a fraud, a highly educated parasite who had spent his entire adult life hunting for a wealthy family to attach himself to. He specifically targeted affluent Black families in the D.C. and Maryland area because he understood a very dark psychological truth about people like my parents. He knew that Valerie and Roland were so deeply insecure about their own new wealth that they would gladly bleed themselves dry to buy the validation of a white man from a historically powerful family. Jasmine was the absolute perfect mark for his scheme. She was spoiled, completely lacking in basic financial literacy, and desperate for a fairy tale life that looked good in glossy photographs. Preston did not love my sister. He did not even respect her. He married her solely to secure an unlimited credit line, funded entirely by the relentless ego of my father. For the first 2 years of their marriage, the arrangement worked flawlessly for Preston. Jasmine lived in a state of absolute delusion, believing she was the queen of Boston society, while spending her father's money at an astonishing rate. She demanded a lifestyle that far exceeded even what my parents could comfortably afford. There were spontaneous first-class trips to the Maldives, massive renovations to their historic Boston townhouse that Roland paid for entirely in cash, and endless shopping sprees at luxury boutiques. Valerie encouraged all of it, terrified that if Jasmine did not keep up appearances, Preston's prestigious family would look down on them. My mother would rather go entirely bankrupt than have a group of broke Boston snobs think she was poor. Preston played his part perfectly during this time, smiling for the cameras, attending the charity galas, and allowing my parents to parade him around their country club like a shiny trophy. But his affection came with a hefty monthly invoice that my father was secretly struggling to pay. The reality of math is unforgiving, and my father's checking accounts were not bottomless. The initial $980,000 wedding check had already severely crippled his liquidity. To keep up with the absurd demands of his golden child and her parasitic husband Roland, began making incredibly dangerous financial decisions. He quietly liquidated his remaining stock portfolios, taking massive penalties just to access the cash. He completely drained his retirement accounts, erasing decades of hard work. When that cash ran out, he did the one thing wealthy people only do when they are truly desperate. He secretly took out a massive secondary mortgage on their Potomac mansion. He could not go to a traditional bank because his debt-to-income ratio was already a disaster, so he signed the paperwork with a high-interest private lender. He accepted predatory terms, hoping he could somehow out-earn the crushing interest rates before my mother found out the truth. He was gambling his entire legacy, his home and his business, just to make sure his ungrateful son-in-law never had to get a real job. Eventually, the cash flow began to stutter. The first sign of the impending collapse happened when Jasmine's platinum credit card was declined at a luxury boutique in New York City. She called my father in an absolute panic, throwing a massive temper tantrum right there in the store, complaining that the cashier had looked at her with pity. Roland scrambled to wire funds from his business operating accounts to cover the embarrassment, but the damage to the facade was already done. Preston realized the unlimited ATM he had married into was suddenly dispensing empty promises. The moment the money started slowing down, the romantic illusion of their marriage instantly shattered into a million pieces. Behind the closed doors of their expensive Boston townhouse, the fighting became violent and constant. Preston dropped the charming, supportive husband act completely. His true nature clawed its way to the surface, revealing a cold, calculating monster. He began verbally attacking Jasmine, mocking her intelligence, and throwing her financial dependence in his face. He demanded to know why her father was suddenly cutting back on their lifestyle maintenance. He would cruelly remind her that without his family name, she was just a loud, spoiled girl from Maryland playing dress-up. The microaggressions he used to hide behind polite smiles became blatant racial insults designed to break her down and keep her submissive. Jasmine, having never faced a real problem or a genuine rejection in her entire life, did not know how to cope with the sudden cruelty. She screamed and cried, calling my parents at all hours of the night, demanding more money to keep her husband happy. She blamed Roland for embarrassing her in front of Preston and his friends. She was so completely brainwashed by her desperate need for prestige that she could not see that her husband was nothing more than a high-class con artist who was ready to jump ship the moment the water reached his ankles. Instead of leaving him, she begged her parents to fix it to send more cash to buy back his fake affection. Valerie and Roland were trapped in a living nightmare of their own making. They were skipping their own mortgage payments just to send hush money to Preston, desperately trying to keep the toxic marriage intact. Valerie paced the marble floors of her mansion late at night, terrified of the whispers that would spread through Potomac if Jasmine got divorced. They were living in a constant state of pure, suffocating panic. Every time the phone rang, they jumped, terrified it was a collection agency or a private creditor calling to seize their assets. They had sacrificed their independent, hardworking daughter to protect a beautiful lie, and now that lie was suffocating them. The walls of their Potomac mansion were literally closing in, and the fake elite society they loved so much was entirely oblivious to their suffering. They were bleeding to death in the dark, completely isolated by their own toxic pride, oblivious to the fact that the very daughter they threw away was currently holding the keys to the city. The collision between my hidden reality and my family's crumbling facade finally happened on a humid Tuesday afternoon in late spring. Jasmine was back in Maryland, having temporarily fled Boston after another violent screaming match with Preston over maxed out credit cards and unpaid country club dues. She was driving her pristine white Porsche Macan, a car that Roland was currently 3 months behind on leasing payments. She was cruising blindly through the ultra-exclusive wooded roads of Bethesda, desperately trying to soothe her bruised, fragile ego by driving through neighborhoods she believed she inherently belonged in. She was likely plotting her next emotional manipulation tactic, figuring out exactly how to cry to our parents so they would drain their last remaining retirement accounts just to appease her angry, arrogant husband. She needed to feel important and wealthy, even if that wealth was entirely a mirage built on our father's secret ruinous debt. As fate would have it, a local utility crew was performing emergency waterline repairs on the main thoroughfare, forcing all civilian traffic to detour slowly through the highly private residential streets. Jasmine's Porsche was forced to a creeping crawl, moving bumper to bumper, right along the perimeter of my massive stone wall. She was trapped exactly where I did not want her to be, sitting in idle, frustrated traffic directly outside the towering iron security gates of my $3 million estate. She sat in her heated leather seat, tapping her manicured nails impatiently on the steering wheel, glaring at the imposing security cameras and the thick privacy hedges that entirely shielded my sanctuary from the public street. In her desperate mind, she was probably burning with a bitter, jealous rage, wondering which powerful politician or tech billionaire lived behind those walls, effortlessly enjoying the infinite financial security she felt she was fundamentally owed by the universe. She looked at those massive iron gates and deeply resented whoever was on the other side. She rolled down her tinted window to get some fresh air, trying to calm her rising anxiety about her own impending financial disaster. Suddenly, the heavy iron gates of my property began to emit a low mechanical hum as they slowly swung inward. Jasmine naturally looked over, her insatiable curiosity getting the better of her superficial vanity. She watched closely as a sleek, jet-black Maybach glided smoothly up the sweeping, circular stone driveway, reflecting the bright afternoon sun off its polished surface. She saw my private security team step out from the guardhouse, moving with practiced military precision to secure the perimeter before the vehicle even came to a complete stop. She saw the team of professional landscapers quietly pruning the exotic flowers near the cascading water features. She was witnessing the seamless, quiet operation of a high-net-worth household, a level of dedicated service and elite security that far exceeded even the wealthiest members of her fake social circle in Boston. The Maybach came to a gentle stop right in front of the massive double-glass doors of the modern mansion. Jasmine leaned forward in her car, her eyes glued to the scene unfolding just 50 yards away. The chauffeur immediately stepped out and walked briskly around the vehicle to open the rear passenger door. And then I stepped out. I was wearing a custom-tailored ivory pantsuit, holding a leather portfolio containing acquisition documents worth more than Preston's entire fabricated lineage. I paused on the stone driveway, pushing a pair of designer sunglasses up into my hair. I turned to speak casually with my head of security, giving him a brief nod of approval regarding the perimeter check before turning my gaze briefly toward the street. For one terrifying microsecond, my eyes swept over the line of idle cars beyond the gate and landed directly on the white Porsche. I did not recognize the car, and I certainly could not see through the glare of her windshield. But Jasmine saw me. She saw me with absolute, terrifying clarity. She saw the posture of complete authority, the relaxed, unbothered confidence of a woman who owned everything she touched. She saw the sister she had mocked and left for dead standing in the center of a literal fortress of unimaginable wealth. I turned around and walked through the soaring glass doors of my home, and the heavy iron gates slowly pulled completely shut behind me, locking the outside world away once again. Inside the Porsche, Jasmine's brain completely stopped functioning. The cognitive dissonance was so violently extreme that her mind simply could not process the visual information it had just received. She blinked rapidly, staring blankly at the closed iron gates, trying desperately to convince herself she was hallucinating from the stress of her failing marriage. It had to be a mistake. It had to be an assistant who looked like me, or a crazy impossible coincidence. The Aaliyah she knew was a pathetic, miserable failure who begged our mother for $50,000. The Aaliyah she knew was an outcast living in a gutter, regretting her choices to defy the family. The Aaliyah she knew was not stepping out of a chauffeur-driven Maybach at a $3 million estate surrounded by men wearing earpieces. The brutal, undeniable reality crashed into her fragile psyche like a runaway freight train. The face was undeniably mine. The posture was mine. The reality of the immense wealth was entirely mine. Jasmine let out a strangled, gasping sound as all the air was suddenly sucked out of her lungs. Her hands began to shake so violently that she dropped her phone into the passenger footwell. The cars behind her began to blare their horns as the traffic finally started to clear, but her foot remained completely frozen on the brake pedal. Her vision tunneled, and dark spots began dancing wildly at the edges of her sight. She was having a full-blown massive panic attack right there in the middle of the road. She managed to swerve the Porsche violently onto the narrow shoulder of the road, the expensive tires crunching loudly over the loose gravel. She slammed the car into park and ripped her seatbelt off, clutching her chest as she struggled to pull oxygen into her seizing lungs. The perfectly constructed delusional reality she had lived in for her entire life was shattering into microscopic pieces all around her. All the terrible, malicious things she had said to me, all the smug looks of superiority, all the times she had laughed while my parents tore me down, rushed through her mind in a sickening, terrifying loop. She was married to a broke, abusive fraud, and her parents were secretly drowning in foreclosure notices. And the sister they had all completely discarded, the one they explicitly told did not deserve a single dime of help, was sitting on a throne of infinite power, right in their own backyard. Jasmine gripped the steering wheel and let out a hysterical, sobbing scream that tore through her throat and echoed in the confined space of her car. The sheer scale of my success was a direct physical attack on her fragile, artificial existence. She realized in that claustrophobic, terrifying moment that she was not the princess of the family anymore. She was the beggar. She fumbled blindly for her phone on the floorboard, her perfect acrylic nails scraping frantically against the carpet. She needed her mother. She needed Valerie to tell her she was crazy, to tell her it was a lie, to somehow fix the terrifying truth she had just witnessed. The golden child was officially broken, and the panic consuming her was just a small taste of the misery that was about to consume them all. Jasmine snatched her phone from the floorboard, her fingers trembling violently. She hit Valerie's contact and held the phone to her ear, gasping for air. Valerie answered on the second ring. Jasmine did not even say hello. She just started sobbing uncontrollably into the receiver, her words tumbling out in a hysterical, panicked rush. "Mom, you have to tell me what is going on." She choked out, her chest heaving. "How does she have that, Mom? How does she have a mansion?" Valerie immediately dropped her pleasant tone and snapped at Jasmine to calm down and speak clearly. "What are you talking about?" Valerie demanded. "Aaliyah." Jasmine screamed, her voice cracking. "I just saw Aaliyah in Bethesda. She was stepping out of a Maybach, Mom. She has a security team and a huge estate. It is a fortress. How does the family failure live in a $3 million house while we are drowning?" Valerie's initial reaction was pure, unadulterated denial. She let out a harsh, dismissive laugh and told Jasmine she was losing her mind from the stress of her marriage to Preston. Valerie insisted that Aaliyah was likely bankrupt and living in a gutter somewhere. She told Jasmine that her eyes were playing tricks on her, or that she had simply seen someone who looked like her sister. But Jasmine refused to back down. She described the tailored ivory suit, the leather portfolio, the quiet authority radiating from the woman stepping onto the stone driveway. She described the heavy iron gates shutting out the world. "She was not a guest, Mom," Jasmine cried, gripping the steering wheel. "She owned the place. I saw the way the guards looked at her. She is filthy rich, and you told me she was ruined. The sheer terror in Jasmine's voice finally penetrated Valerie's thick wall of delusion. Valerie hung up the phone and called Roland, who was sitting in his home office, actively ignoring another stack of past-due mortgage notices. She relayed Jasmine's frantic sighting and watched her husband's face contort into a mask of pure defensive rage. Roland refused to entertain the idea that the daughter he discarded had somehow conquered the world without his guidance. It was psychologically impossible for his narcissism to process that Aaliyah could be successful. He immediately began constructing an alternate reality to soothe their bruising egos. He told Valerie that Aaliyah was probably just a glorified assistant running errands for a wealthy boss. When Valerie pointed out the Maybach and the custom suit, Roland's theories turned darker and more desperate. He convinced his wife that Aaliyah must be a mistress to a corrupt politician or a highly paid escort for some foreign billionaire. They desperately needed to believe that Aaliyah's apparent wealth was dirty, shameful, and dependent on someone else. They needed her to be a parasite just like Preston, so they could retain their false sense of moral superiority. Roland decided they needed absolute proof of her degradation. He reached into his dwindling business accounts and hired a highly discreet private investigator based in Washington to dig into every single aspect of Aaliyah's life. Roland wanted financial records, property deeds, and scandalous photographs. He wanted the dirt that would prove his eldest daughter was a complete fraud. He wanted a weapon he could use to destroy her if she ever dared to show her face in their social circles again. They spent the next 4 days waiting in a state of toxic anticipation, eager to see the devastating report that would put Aaliyah right back in her place beneath their expensive, polished shoes. The private investigator arrived at the Potomac mansion on a rainy Friday morning. Valerie and Roland sat rigidly on their velvet sofa, the very same sofa where they had condemned Aaliyah to poverty 3 years prior. They offered the investigator coffee, putting on their best performance of concerned, loving parents who were simply worried about a wayward child. The private investigator, a hardened man who had seen every type of family betrayal, simply declined the coffee and opened his thick leather briefcase. He did not hand them a thin folder with a few grainy photos of Aaliyah holding hands with an older man. Instead, he pulled out a massive stack of certified financial documents, corporate registry files, and property deeds. He placed the heavy stack on the glass coffee table and looked at my parents with a completely neutral expression. Valerie leaned forward, her eyes hungry for the scandal she had fabricated in her mind. "Who is she sleeping with?" Roland asked, his voice dripping with preemptive disgust. "Who is funding this little charade?" The investigator shook his head slowly. "No one is funding her," he stated flatly. "She is completely single. There are no wealthy men, no sugar daddies, no secret politicians backing her lifestyle." Valerie let out a nervous scoff, refusing to comprehend the words. "Then how is she affording a gated estate in Bethesda?" she demanded. "She rents it, obviously." The investigator tapped the top document on the stack. "She does not rent," he replied. "She purchased the Bethesda property 3 weeks ago for $3 million in pure untraceable cash. She also owns a fleet of luxury vehicles outright." Roland snatched the documents, his hands trembling as his eyes scanned the highlighted figures. His face drained of all color as he read the numbers. "This is impossible," Roland muttered, his voice shrinking into a pathetic whisper. "Where is the money coming from?" The investigator leaned back in his chair and delivered the fatal blow to their entire existence. "She is the sole founder and anonymous CEO of Apex Holdings. She is the private equity firm that has been buying up the entire commercial district. Her estimated net worth is in the high 8 figures and growing daily. She is not a mistress or an assistant. She is a titan." The words hung in the oppressive air of the living room, destroying everything Valerie and Roland believed about themselves and their world. The daughter they deemed unworthy of $50,000 was now wealthy enough to buy their entire lives and sell them for scrap. The golden child they had bankrupted themselves for was married to a broke fraud. The elite society they worshipped meant absolutely nothing compared to the shadow empire Aaliyah had built. The heavy silence in the room was the sound of their fake dynasty collapsing into dust. The morning after my parents' private investigator finalized his report, my own security infrastructure triggered a silent alarm. I was sitting in my private home office reviewing a commercial lease agreement when my head of security knocked gently on the heavy oak door. He walked in with a sleek encrypted tablet and a very serious expression on his face. He informed me that our cybersecurity team had detected multiple aggressive queries attempting to penetrate the outer layers of my corporate shell companies. Someone was actively pulling public property records in Bethesda and cross-referencing them with business licenses registered in Delaware. They had not breached the core network, but they had scraped enough surface data to connect my physical address to the Apex Holdings corporate umbrella. I asked him if it was a rival firm or a financial journalist sniffing around for a story. He shook his head and slid the tablet across my custom marble desk. It was not a corporate spy trying to steal my acquisition strategies. His team had traced the digital footprint back to a low-rent private investigator based in downtown Washington, and that investigator had been hired directly by Roland, my father. The news sent a brief hollow chill through my chest, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating calm. Jasmine must have seen me. The traffic jam outside my gates the day before immediately made sense. She had spotted me and ran crying to our parents, and their fragile egos demanded immediate answers. They knew. The impenetrable wall of anonymity I had built over 3 grueling years had finally been breached by the sheer desperate curiosity of the family I had left behind. My head of security asked if I wanted him to deploy our legal team to bury the investigator in cease and desist orders and aggressive privacy lawsuits. I stared at the glowing screen showing my father's name on the wire transfer receipt used to pay the investigator. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow, deliberate breath. I told my security chief to let them look. I told him to let my parents feast their eyes on the absolute towering magnitude of the empire they had tried to prevent me from building. Let them see the exact dollar amounts they missed out on by choosing their golden child over me. But I was not going to just sit back and let them analyze my life without returning the favor. If they wanted to play games with private investigators and secret background checks, I was going to show them what an actual intelligence operation looked like. I authorized a massive unlimited budget counter-investigation into every single member of my biological family, but I told my team to focus their absolute sharpest, most invasive tools directly on the golden ticket himself. I wanted every single detail about Preston and his supposedly flawless Boston lineage. I wanted to know exactly what kind of man my parents had traded me for. It took my forensic accounting team exactly 48 hours to completely dismantle the glittering fake facade of Preston's entire existence. The dossier they delivered to my desk was so incredibly damning that it almost made me laugh out loud right there in my office. Preston was not just a minor disappointment. He was a colossal generational fraud. The old money Boston political dynasty that my parents bragged about to their country club friends had been completely financially dead for over 2 decades. Preston's parents were currently dodging aggressive creditors and living in a crumbling, heavily mortgaged house they could not afford to heat properly during the winter. Preston himself was an absolute financial black hole. He had 0 personal assets, 0 investment portfolios, and absolutely no legitimate income stream. What he did have was a staggering amount of hidden debt. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-interest personal loans, maxed out secret credit cards and outstanding markers at illegal underground poker rooms scattered across the eastern seaboard. The elite lifestyle he was flaunting in my parents' faces was funded entirely by my father's rapidly depleting bank accounts. Preston was bleeding my family dry, using their desperate need for social validation as a weapon to finance his own pathetic, fake existence. My parents had sacrificed their independent, hardworking daughter to protect their pride, and in return, they had welcomed a parasitic con artist right into their living room. They thought they had purchased a political legacy, but they had actually bought a sinking ship. But the financial ruin was not even the most explosive piece of evidence my team uncovered. While the accountants tracked the missing money, my private security contractors physically followed Preston through the streets of the city. They placed him under absolute, round-the-clock surveillance monitoring his daily routine, while Jasmine was busy shopping and complaining to my mother. It did not take long for his disgusting personal habits to come to light. My lead investigator handed me a thick envelope filled with high-resolution surveillance photographs and detailed audio transcripts. Preston was actively and brazenly having an affair. He was not even trying to hide it very well. The photos showed him walking into expensive boutique hotels in the middle of the afternoon, holding hands and passionately kissing a stunning blonde woman. The surveillance team even captured video footage of them laughing together on a restaurant balcony, while he paid the bill with a credit card registered to my father. She was not a random stranger. My team quickly identified her as a highly sought-after luxury event planner in the metropolitan area. Preston was using my father's money to book extravagant weekend getaways and buy expensive jewelry for his mistress, while Jasmine sat at home maxing out her credit cards to maintain the illusion of a perfect marriage. The sheer audacity of his betrayal was staggering. He was cheating on the golden child with the very money my parents had begged and borrowed to give him. I stared at the glossy photographs of Preston wrapped around his mistress in the lobby of a luxury hotel, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. My parents wanted to look into my life to find failure and disgrace, but all they found was my absolute dominance. I looked into their lives, and I found the exact weapon I needed to completely obliterate their fake world. The ammunition was loaded, and I was just waiting for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. The ammunition was loaded, and I was just waiting for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. The wait was remarkably short. Less than 72 hours after my security team handed me the surveillance photos of Preston and his mistress, a massive delivery arrived at the heavily guarded front gates of my Bethesda estate. My head of security called my private line to inform me that a courier had dropped off a package explicitly addressed to me from my parents. I instructed him to bring it to my home office after thoroughly screening it for any security risks. He walked in carrying an absurdly large luxury gift basket wrapped in ridiculous gold cellophane and tied with a massive silk ribbon. It was overflowing with imported caviar, expensive vintage champagne artisanal cheeses, and gourmet truffles. It was exactly the kind of performative, over-the-top corporate gift you send to a wealthy client you are desperately trying to bribe into a lucrative contract. Nestled right in the center of the ostentatious display was a thick cream-colored envelope made of heavy, expensive cardstock. I sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener. Inside was a handwritten note from my mother, Valerie. The elegant cursive writing flowed across the page, dripping with a sickeningly sweet artificial warmth that immediately made my stomach turn. "My dearest Aaliyah," she wrote, "we have been doing so much soul-searching lately. Life is simply too short for silly family misunderstandings. Your father and I miss our eldest daughter terribly, and our home feels incredibly empty without you. We are so incredibly proud of the beautiful, successful woman you have become, and we would love nothing more than to reconnect and heal the past." I read the words and let out a cold, harsh laugh that echoed loudly in the empty space of my home office. Soul-searching. What a pathetic, transparent lie. They had not been doing any soul-searching. They had been doing asset-searching. They did not miss their eldest daughter. They missed the multi-million-dollar net worth they now knew I possessed. The gift basket was not an olive branch. It was a desperately deployed fishing lure. Valerie and Roland were drowning in their hidden secondary mortgages and their crushing mounting debt. Their golden child Jasmine was draining them dry to please her parasitic, cheating husband Preston. The private investigator they hired to find dirt on me had accidentally revealed that I was the only person in their entire orbit with enough liquid capital to save them from total social and financial ruin. They thought they could just buy me off with a basket of stale truffles and a few empty fake words of praise. They actually believed I was still that desperate validation-starved girl who would jump at the first tiny scrap of parental affection they tossed in my direction. They thought I was stupid enough to forget the day they proudly watched me pack up my life and walk out into the cold. Attached to the back of the handwritten note was a formal invitation to an intimate family dinner at their Potomac mansion scheduled for that coming Friday. They claimed it would be just the immediate family, a quiet, safe space for us to finally bridge the gap and become a whole united family again. Reading the invitation felt like looking into the mind of a predator that was severely underestimating its prey. My parents were terrified of losing their elite status. The walls of their fake dynasty were closing in on them, and the bank was practically breathing down my father's neck. They needed a massive injection of cash to maintain the charade, and they had pinpointed me as their primary target. They were going to use this dinner to set the stage to butter me up with fake compliments before inevitably dropping the hammer and asking for a financial bailout under the guise of family loyalty. My initial instinct was to throw the entire basket into the trash compactor and ignore the invitation completely. I had absolutely no desire to sit across a dining table and pretend to play happy family with the very people who had deliberately tried to destroy my future. But as I looked down at the surveillance photos of Preston kissing his mistress and thought about my father's crumbling business accounts, an entirely different strategy began to take shape in my mind. Refusing the invitation would simply keep them at bay, keeping the conflict unresolved. Attending the dinner, however, would allow me to walk directly into the heart of their desperation. I wanted to look them in the eyes and watch them perform their desperate little play. I wanted to see exactly how low they were willing to stoop to get their hands on my money. I wanted to hear the exact lies they had prepared to justify their sudden change of heart. Going to that dinner was not a step toward forgiveness. It was a crucial reconnaissance mission in a war they did not even know they were fighting. I told my executive assistant to reply to the invitation confirming my attendance. I did not send a gift back. I did not call my mother to express my gratitude for the champagne or the caviar. I simply confirmed I would be there at 8 o'clock on Friday evening and spent the rest of the week preparing my mindset for the ultimate psychological warfare. I was going to let them lay out their trap, and I was going to watch them step right into it with absolute precision. They thought they were reeling in a naive, lucrative investor to save their sinking ship. They had no idea they were actively inviting the architect of their destruction right through their front door. I went to my custom walk-in closet and began selecting the perfect armor for the evening. I chose a tailored emerald green suit that screamed of quiet, untouchable power. It was not flashy or heavily branded, but the cut and the fabric communicated a level of wealth that entirely eclipsed my mother's desperate need for designer labels. I paired it with a simple luxury watch and a pair of sharp stilettos. I was not going to dress to impress them. I was going to dress to remind them that I was completely out of their league. I stood in front of the full-length mirror and practiced my expression. I wiped away any trace of the wounded daughter who had begged them for a $50,000 loan 3 years ago. I replaced her with the cold, calculating anonymous CEO of Apex Holdings. The fake olive branch had been extended, and I was fully prepared to snap it right in half. My parents were about to put on the performance of a lifetime, trying to convince me that blood was thicker than water. They were going to leverage every ounce of emotional manipulation they had ever honed to force me into opening my checkbook for the golden child and her fake husband. They were walking blindly into a slaughter. I packed the surveillance photos into a sleek leather briefcase and left the gift basket rotting on the floor of my office. Friday night was going to be an absolute revelation. I was ready to let them dig their own graves right there in the dining room. Friday evening arrived with a heavy downpour of rain washing over the Potomac area. I sat in the back of my chauffeured car watching the familiar wrought iron gates of my parents' mansion loom in the distance. My driver pulled onto the circular stone driveway and parked right behind Preston's leased luxury sports car. I stepped out into the rain, sheltered by a large umbrella held by my private security detail. I walked up the grand steps and pushed the heavy front door open without knocking. The house smelled exactly the same. A suffocating blend of expensive floral arrangements and harsh lemon floor wax. Valerie and Roland were waiting for me in the foyer wearing wide, unnatural smiles that stretched across their faces like tight plastic masks. Jasmine and Preston were hovering just behind them in the formal dining room, looking incredibly tense and anxious. My mother rushed forward and wrapped her arms around my shoulders, pulling me into a rigid hug that lacked any actual warmth or affection. "Oh, Aaliyah, my darling girl," she cooed, stepping back to admire my tailored emerald green suit. "You look absolutely stunning today, and we are so incredibly thrilled that you decided to finally come home to us." I offered a polite, tight smile and handed my wet coat to the housekeeper, who was standing quietly in the corner. "It is good to be here," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any real emotion. My father stepped up and gave me a firm, overly enthusiastic pat on the back, ushering me into the dining room, where a lavish multi-course feast had already been prepared by a private chef. We took our seats at the long mahogany dining table. Preston sat across from me, refusing to meet my eyes directly, while Jasmine picked nervously at her expensive cloth napkin. The tension in the air was so thick you could physically choke on it, but my parents relentlessly pushed forward with their sickeningly sweet performance. As the private chef served the first course of seared scallops, Valerie raised her crystal wine glass for a grand toast. "To our beautiful and brilliant Aaliyah," she announced, her voice echoing loudly in the large room. "Your father and I have been watching your career blossom from afar, and we could not be more bursting with pride at everything you have accomplished. We always knew you possessed this incredible fierce ambition deep inside your heart." Roland nodded vigorously, taking a long, slow sip of his vintage red wine. "Absolutely," he chimed in, leaning forward and resting his heavy elbows on the polished wood table. "We knew you had the fire inside you, Aaliyah." Looking back, we realized that our tough love approach 3 years ago might have seemed a bit harsh at the time, but you have to admit, it was the exact catalyst you needed to push you toward this remarkable greatness. We wanted you to build your own financial muscles and look at the absolute titan you have become today. I slowly cut a piece of my scallop, chewing it deliberately, while their toxic words washed over me. They were actively trying to rewrite history right in front of my face, framing their cruel abandonment and vicious insults as a brilliant intentional parenting strategy. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation and severe gaslighting. I just nodded softly, letting them believe their pathetic narrative was actually working on me. "You certainly taught me a lot about how the real world operates," I replied, keeping my expression completely blank and neutral. By the time the main course was cleared away and the dessert plates were set down, the fake pleasantries began to rapidly evaporate from the room. Roland cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his high-backed leather chair. "The truth is, Aaliyah," he began, his voice dropping to a serious conspiratorial tone, "we invited you here tonight because the family business is going through a very brief temporary cash flow restructuring phase. The market has been highly volatile, and we have a massive commercial loan balloon payment coming due next week. We have the concrete assets, of course, but the liquid cash is currently tied up in other vital long-term investments." He looked at me with hungry, desperate eyes that completely betrayed his calm tone. "We just need a signature, Aaliyah. We need you to leverage your corporate entities to co-sign a temporary commercial loan to bridge the gap for a few months. It is merely a small formality for someone with your massive real estate portfolio." Before I could even process the audacity of his request, Valerie jumped right in, eager to secure her own piece of my hard-earned wealth. "And since we are talking about family unity," Valerie added, leaning across the table with a strained, frantic smile, "we also need to discuss your sister. Jasmine and Preston are rapidly outgrowing their current living situation in Boston. Preston's political family is expecting them to entertain at a much higher social level, and their current townhouse simply lacks the proper prestige and square footage. It is causing terrible stress and strain on their new marriage. We think it would be a beautiful gesture of sisterly love if you purchased a new estate for them in Beacon Hill to help them keep up appearances. Consider it a late wedding gift, since you were unable to attend their special day 3 years ago. The absolute sheer audacity of their synchronized demands was breathtaking. My father wanted me to guarantee his massive secret debt, while my mother demanded I buy a multi-million-dollar mansion for the exact man who was currently bleeding them dry and actively cheating on her golden child. They wanted to drain my corporate accounts to plug the gaping holes in a sinking ship they had steered directly into an iceberg. Preston finally looked up at me, a smug, entitled look returning to his face, clearly expecting me to fold under the immense pressure of my parents' emotional manipulation. Jasmine held her breath, waiting for me to blindly hand over the keys to a brand new luxury life she did not earn. I sat there staring at the four of them, and I did not get angry. I did not throw my wine in their faces or scream about the sheer hypocrisy of their selfish requests. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and let a warm, generous smile spread across my face. "You know, Mom and Dad," I said softly, picking up my wine glass by the stem. "I have done a lot of deep thinking lately about family legacy and what it means to truly support one another in times of need. I completely understand the urgent need to maintain our pristine image in front of Preston's prestigious Boston relatives." Valerie let out a massive, heavy sigh of relief while Roland slumped back in his chair, fully believing he had just secured his financial salvation. Before we dive into the dull paperwork of real estate acquisitions and commercial loans, I continued, my voice dripping with smooth, calculated sweetness. I think we need to celebrate our reunion properly. Jasmine and Preston have their third anniversary coming up next month. I want to host a massive anniversary gala for them to show the world how united we are. I want to invite all of our Potomac friends and Preston's entire Boston family circle. I will cover all the expenses myself and host it at the Grand Solarium. It will be my personal way of showing my absolute unwavering support for this family and proving that I understand my role in our legacy. I watched as Jasmine's eyes lit up with greedy delight at the mention of the Grand Solarium, knowing it was the most exclusive and expensive venue in the entire city. Preston nodded his approval, taking a sip of his wine, completely unaware of the surveillance photos sitting in the briefcase in my car, showing him kissing his mistress. My parents raised their glasses in a toast to my generosity, completely blind to the reality that they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy their entire fake empire. The deadly trap was beautifully set, and they smiled blindly as the steel jaws snapped shut around them. The trap was set, and they walked into it blindly, willingly, eagerly. The very next morning, I instructed my executive assistant to officially block out the entire master calendar for the Grand Solarium for the second weekend of the following month. The Grand Solarium was not just a venue, it was an architectural masterpiece located in the absolute heart of the capital. It featured soaring vaulted ceilings made entirely of imported glass and indoor botanical gardens that bloomed year-round. Booking it for a single evening required a minimum deposit of $200,000, and the waiting list was typically 3 years long for anyone without supreme political connections. My parents had always dreamed of hosting an event there, but they could never afford the staggering price tag, and they certainly did not have the social capital to bypass the waiting list. They thought I was spending a fortune to secure the space for them. They thought I was bleeding my own accounts dry to buy my way back into their good graces. They did not know that I owned the Grand Solarium. They did not know that the building belonged to one of the many anonymous holding companies managed by Apex Holdings. I was not renting a venue. I was simply opening the doors to my own private execution chamber. The moment the electronic invitations went out, the gloating began. It spread like a toxic virus through the affluent circles of Potomac and Boston. Jasmine and Preston could not contain their immense, arrogant pride. They treated the upcoming anniversary gala as their ultimate royal coronation. Jasmine spent her days having lunch at expensive country clubs, loudly bragging to anyone who would listen about how her estranged older sister had finally come to her senses. She told her friends that I was desperately begging for forgiveness. She told them that I was paying my dues to the family by throwing her the most lavish party of the decade. She painted a pathetic picture of me as a desperate, lonely woman trying to buy back the love of a family I had selfishly abandoned. She painted herself as the magnanimous golden child graciously allowing the black sheep to grovel at her feet, to grovel at her feet, to grovel at her feet. The repetition of those lies did not anger me anymore. It only fueled the cold, calculating fire burning in my chest. Preston was even worse. His ego inflated to astronomical proportions. He called his bankrupt relatives in Boston, bragging about the incredible display of wealth his in-laws were putting on for him. He spun a ridiculous narrative that my parents were so completely indebted to his superior family lineage that they were forcing their wealthy eldest daughter to finance the entire celebration just to appease him. He paraded around town buying custom, tailored tuxedos on my father's dwindling credit lines, acting like a king, demanding tribute from his subjects. He truly believed he had conquered us all. He truly believed his fake charm had secured him a lifetime supply of endless free luxury. He had no idea that every time he swiped my father's credit card, the financial alerts were being monitored by my own private accounting team. He had no idea his entire miserable existence was currently living under a microscope. Valerie and Roland were equally insufferable. They used the gala as a massive public relations campaign to distract from their hidden financial ruin. They called every prominent politician, federal judge, and wealthy business owner they knew, ensuring the guest list was a who is who of the local elite. They wanted a massive audience to witness their perceived triumph. They wanted everyone to see that they had successfully brought their rebellious, independent daughter back to heel. They told their friends that my success was a direct result of their harsh but necessary parenting. They took absolute credit for my wealth, claiming they had molded me into a titan of industry. They used my name, my money, and my venue to build a temporary flimsy shelter over their collapsing house of cards. They were dancing on the edge of a massive cliff, and they were inviting everyone they knew to come and watch. While they were busy selecting imported silk table linens and arguing over which vintage of champagne to serve, I was quietly and meticulously preparing the venue for absolute destruction. I did not hire standard event planners or typical audio-visual technicians. I brought in my own elite corporate cybersecurity team. I needed absolute control over every single electronic device in the Grand Solarium. I spent late nights walking through the empty glass hall, echoing with the sound of my own footsteps, planning the exact sequence of events. I directed my technicians to install hidden high-definition projectors that could instantly override the main presentation screens. I had them route the entire sound system through a secure encrypted tablet that only I could access. I made sure that when the moment came, no one would be able to pull the plug or cut the power. We tested the system repeatedly, over and over again until it was absolutely flawless. We projected the surveillance photos of Preston and his mistress onto the massive walls of glass. We played the audio recordings of his secret hotel rendezvous through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. The images of his betrayal towered 30 feet high, completely dominating the elegant botanical gardens. I stood in the center of the empty ballroom, watching Preston's deceit flash across the screens in brilliant high-definition color. I watched the evidence of my parents' financial ruin follow right after. The foreclosure notices, the predatory loan documents, the absolute proof of their fake elite status displayed for all to see. It was a devastating symphony of truth, and I was the sole conductor. I also made a very specific adjustment to the venue's security protocols. The Grand Solarium featured heavy solid oak doors at every entrance and exit, designed to keep unwanted press away from high-profile events. I had my security chief reprogram the electronic locking mechanisms. I wanted the ability to seal the entire room with the push of a single button. When the truth finally came out, I knew exactly how they would react. Valerie would try to run, Roland would try to hide, Preston would try to slip out the back door to avoid facing the consequences of his pathetic actions. I was not going to let a single one of them escape. They were going to sit there and watch their entire fake dynasty burn to the ground. They were going to feel the exact same trapping, suffocating panic I felt when they told me I did not deserve any help. The final week leading up to the gala was a masterclass in psychological discipline. I attended 2 incredibly tedious planning meetings with my mother and Jasmine, sitting across from them while they tasted expensive cakes and debated the merits of white roses versus imported orchids. They treated me like a blank checkbook, dismissing my opinions and demanding constant upgrades to the menu. I just smiled and nodded, paying for every single ridiculous request in full. I let them gorge themselves on my money. I let them build their expectations so high that the fall would completely shatter them. I watched Jasmine lovingly touch Preston's arm while he covertly texted his mistress under the table. I watched my father sweat nervously when the catering bill arrived, knowing his own bank accounts were currently negative. The delusion was so thick and heavy you could drown in it. Everything was perfectly aligned. The trap was invisible and the bait had been completely swallowed. My family was eagerly marching toward a spectacular, highly public execution of their own making, and they were wearing their most expensive clothes to attend it. The stage was set, the lighting was focused, and the actors were completely oblivious to the tragedy they were about to perform. I packed my encrypted tablet into my evening clutch and prepared for the greatest night of my entire life. The evening of the anniversary gala finally arrived, carrying with it an air of thick, suffocating anticipation. The grand solarium was completely transformed into a breathtaking display of excessive wealth, just as my mother and sister had demanded. Massive walls of imported glass reflected the soft golden glow of thousands of floating candles suspended above the indoor botanical gardens. The room was quickly filling up with the absolute highest echelon of Potomac society. There were federal judges, prominent surgeons, and powerful real estate developers mingling around the open premium bars. The air was heavy with the scent of expensive designer perfume and the low hum of calculated networking. My parents had spared absolutely no expense when it came to exploiting my open checkbook. They had hired a renowned string quartet to play modern hits with classical instruments, and the highly trained waitstaff circulated seamlessly with silver trays of imported caviar and vintage champagne. Grouped deliberately on the elevated terrace overlooking the main floor were Preston's relatives. They had flown in from Boston wearing their outdated, conservative formal wear, projecting an aura of immense unearned superiority. They stood together in tight little circles, sipping their drinks and casting highly judgmental glances at my parents' affluent black friends. They whispered among themselves, making thinly veiled condescending remarks about the ostentatious display of new money surrounding them. They were drinking my expensive champagne and eating my gourmet food while secretly turning their noses up at the very people who were funding their free luxury vacation. They were completely oblivious to the fact that their own family name was entirely bankrupt, and that the man they were here to celebrate was nothing more than a desperate, greedy grifter. I stood quietly near the back of the massive glass atrium, leaning against a dark marble pillar. I was dressed in a sleek midnight blue gown that fit me like a second skin, completely devoid of any flashy logos or desperate cries for attention. I blended perfectly into the shadows of the room, observing the entire spectacle with the cold, detached precision of a predator watching its prey wander into a snare. My encrypted tablet was safely tucked inside my velvet clutch, resting lightly against my side. My private security team was stationed at every single exit, dressed seamlessly, as event staff waiting for my final signal. I watched the crowd mingle and laugh, completely unaware of the absolute devastation that was currently loaded and waiting in the audiovisual control room right above their heads. A sudden hush fell over the sprawling room as the string quartet dramatically shifted their tempo to announce the guests of honor. The massive oak doors at the top of the grand staircase swung open, and Jasmine and Preston made their highly anticipated entrance. They paused at the top of the stairs, soaking in the roaring applause and the flashing cameras of the hired photographers. Jasmine looked absolutely radiant, draped in a custom beaded gown that cost more than most people's annual salary. She beamed with a greedy, triumphant smile, waving to the crowd like a conquering queen, returning to her adoring subjects. Preston stood beside her wearing his expensive tailored tuxedo, holding her hand with a manufactured look of devoted affection. He waved to his snobby Boston relatives, offering them a smug, knowing nod. They descended the marble staircase slowly, deliberately dragging out every single second of their manufactured glory. They truly believed they were the most important people in the entire world. They believed they had successfully secured a lifetime of infinite, unearned luxury. As the couple reached the main floor, Valerie and Roland immediately rushed forward to intercept them. My parents were completely in their element, surrounded by the very people they had spent their entire lives trying to desperately impress. My father puffed out his chest, shaking Preston's hand with excessive vigor, while my mother pulled Jasmine into a tight, highly photographed embrace. I watched from my dark corner as my parents began dragging the couple around the room, proudly parading them in front of the wealthy Potomac elite. They stopped at a table of prominent politicians, and my mother immediately launched into her rehearsed monologue. Valerie practically shouted over the string music, boasting about the incredible success of her family. She pointed around the lavish glass room, explicitly taking credit for the entire production. She laughed loudly, telling everyone how she and Roland had instilled such fierce ambition and impeccable taste in their daughters. I listened as my father boldly claimed that his business acumen had perfectly guided my real estate ventures. He told a group of affluent doctors that he was the primary reason I was able to afford to host such a magnificent event for my sister. He spoke with such profound delusion, totally erasing the years he spent telling me I was a reckless failure. He happily collected the awe and admiration of his peers, soaking up their compliments about his exceptional parenting and his massive financial success. They were standing quite literally on the edge of a massive financial cliff, actively facing foreclosure and ruin. Yet, they were boldly lying to the entire room about their immense prosperity. They used my venue, my money, and my silent presence to build a towering monument to their own massive egos. Jasmine was busy showing off a massive new diamond necklace to her friends, loudly proclaiming that Preston had surprised her with it just that morning. She had absolutely no idea that the necklace was purchased using a high-interest credit card secretly tied to my father's failing business accounts. She had no idea that while Preston was handing her that jewelry, he was actively texting his mistress to confirm their hotel reservations for the following weekend. The entire room was a suffocating bubble of absolute delusion and fake prestige. Preston's white relatives from Boston were particularly nauseating to observe as they formed a rigid, unapproachable barrier on the upper terrace, clutching their drinks like shields. One of Preston's aunts, an older woman dripping in inherited pearls, actually scoffed loudly when Valerie tried to offer her a specialized cocktail. She waved my mother away with a dismissive flick of her wrist, treating the woman who was currently paying for her luxury vacation like an annoying servant. And the most sickening part was that my mother simply swallowed the insult. Valerie maintained her plastic, eager smile, completely willing to endure blatant disrespect, just to keep the illusion of their prestigious alliance completely intact. I remained anchored to my marble pillar, my face completely impassive. I took a slow sip of sparkling water and let the overwhelming toxicity of the room wash over me without absorbing a single drop of it. They were all performing their desperate little roles exactly as I had anticipated. Jasmine playing the adored Princess Preston, playing the wealthy aristocrat, Valerie and Roland, playing the benevolent, successful monarchs of Potomac. They were entirely consumed by the bright lights, the expensive food, and the intoxicating rush of social validation. They were completely blind to the fact that the heavy oak doors of the Grand Solarium had already been quietly shut and locked by my security detail. They were so busy looking at themselves in the metaphorical mirror that they did not notice the ceiling above them was rigged with high-definition projectors loaded with their absolute destruction. I ran my thumb over the smooth edge of the encrypted tablet hidden inside my clutch, knowing the countdown to their complete public annihilation was now rapidly approaching zero. As the cocktail hour transitioned into its most lively phase, I remained perfectly still in my secluded spot near the glass wall, simply watching the room breathe. The heavy scent of roasted duck and imported truffles drifted through the air, mingling with the endless hum of superficial chatter. That was when Preston finally spotted me. He had just finished kissing up to a local federal judge and was looking for a new target to exercise his manufactured superiority on. He whispered something into Jasmine's ear, and the two of them began making their way across the polished floor toward my dark marble pillar. My mother Valerie, noticing the movement of her prized golden couple, quickly abandoned a conversation with a prominent surgeon and hurried to join them, forming a unified front of absolute toxicity. Preston approached me with a crystal glass of expensive bourbon in his hand, swirling the amber liquid with an arrogant flick of his wrist. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my simple, elegant suit before a condescending smirk stretched across his sharp features. "Well, if it isn't our mysterious real estate mogul," Preston drawled, his voice dripping with a thick layer of patrician entitlement. "Your parents were just telling my family all about your little commercial property venture. It is quite fascinating, really." I took a slow breath, keeping my face completely blank. "I am glad you find it fascinating, Preston," I replied smoothly. He took a sip of his bourbon and leaned in slightly, invading my personal space with the distinct smell of expensive cologne and alcohol. "You know Aaliyah?" He continued, his tone dropping into a mockingly conversational pitch. "I was just explaining to my uncle how the business landscape has changed so drastically lately. It really is a fantastic time for diversity initiatives and minority business grants. My family has been in commercial development in Boston for generations, building real wealth through traditional legacy channels, so we know how brutal the market can be. It must be incredibly refreshing to bypass all that historical groundwork and just ride the wave of corporate guilt. It is pure luck, really, that institutions are practically handing out capital right now to fulfill their quotas. I am sure you are very grateful for the handouts." The thinly veiled racist microaggression hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. He was looking me right in the eye, telling me that my grueling 18-hour days, my brilliant market strategies, and my massive financial empire were nothing more than a charitable handout given to me because of the color of my skin. He was implying that his fake, crumbling white lineage made him inherently superior to my actual hard-earned success. Beside him, Jasmine let out a sharp, high-pitched giggle. She actually laughed. My own biological sister, a black woman who had been handed everything on a silver platter, stood there sipping her vintage champagne and laughed as her fraudulent husband completely invalidated my entire existence with a racist trope. She leaned into Preston's side, wrapping her arm around his waist, and looked at me with a triumphant, mocking gleam in her eye. "It is true, Aaliyah," Jasmine chimed in, her voice overly loud and grating. "You really did get so lucky timing the market like that. Preston was just saying how important it is to be grateful when the system works in your favor." I shifted my gaze from the grinning couple to my mother, fully expecting Valerie to at least maintain the facade of a protective parent in a room full of her peers. Instead, Valerie stepped forward and placed a tense, restrictive hand on my forearm. Her fingers dug sharply into my tailored sleeve. She leaned in close, her eyes darting nervously toward the elevated terrace, where Preston's snobby Boston relatives were observing us. "Aaliyah," my mother hissed in a harsh, reprimanding whisper, "do not give me that look. Preston is simply making a sophisticated observation about the current economic climate." Do not be so terribly sensitive, and please do not start acting defensive. Preston's family is watching us right now, and they are accustomed to a very specific standard of grace. I need you to smile and just know your place tonight. We are not going to have any angry behavior ruining the aesthetic of this gala. Do you understand me? She was policing my tone. My own mother was actively commanding me to swallow a racist insult and smile politely just to protect the fragile ego of the white man who was secretly driving our family into absolute financial ruin. She was demanding that I shrink myself down to nothing so that Preston's bankrupt family would not feel uncomfortable in the venue that I was secretly paying for. The absolute magnitude of their betrayal was so complete and so incredibly pure that it entirely eradicated any microscopic trace of mercy I might have had left in my soul. I did not argue with Valerie. I did not raise my voice at Preston or slap the champagne glass out of Jasmine's hand. I did not give them the angry reaction they were so desperately trying to provoke. I looked at Preston taking in his smug, punchable face and the arrogant slope of his shoulders. I looked at Jasmine, who was practically glowing with the sick satisfaction of watching me be put down. And finally, I looked right into Valerie's eyes, staring deep into the hollow, terrified void of a woman who had sold her soul for a status that did not even exist. The sheer pathetic irony of the situation was intoxicating. They were standing in my building, drinking my alcohol, breathing my air, and telling me to know my place. They were entirely oblivious to the reality that I owned the very ground they were standing on, and that I possessed the power to completely decimate their entire fraudulent existence with a single command. I slowly let a cold, chilling smirk spread across my face. It was not a polite smile, and it was certainly not the submissive, graceful expression my mother had just demanded. It was the terrifying, confident smile of an executioner who had just finished sharpening the blade. Valerie's eyes widened slightly, a brief flash of genuine uncertainty breaking through her practiced mask as she registered the total lack of fear in my expression. She opened her mouth to issue another harsh command, but I simply turned my wrist and looked down at my watch. It was a custom-crafted timepiece, a masterpiece of Swiss engineering that cost more than Preston's entire hidden mountain of gambling debt. The delicate diamond-encrusted hands clicked softly into position. It was exactly 8:30. The cocktail hour was officially over. I lifted my head and looked past the three of them, making direct eye contact with my lead security director, who was positioned perfectly on the opposite side of the sprawling glass atrium. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. He immediately tapped the discreet earpiece hidden beneath his collar and turned toward the control room. The heavy oak doors of the grand solarium locked with a muffled, synchronized thud. The ultimate trap was completely sealed. I looked back at Preston and my family, my smirk widening into a grin. "You are absolutely right, Preston," I said, my voice eerily calm and melodic over the sound of the string quartet. "Luck is a fascinating concept, but I prefer absolute control. Excuse me, it is time for my toast." I turned my back on the four of them and began my slow, deliberate walk across the sprawling glass atrium toward the elevated main stage. The fabric of my midnight blue gown swept silently across the polished marble floor. I felt the eyes of the room begin to shift in my direction as I approached the microphone stand. My father Roland puffed out his chest, looking around at his wealthy friends, expecting me to deliver a groveling, tearful speech about how grateful I was to be welcomed back into their elite circle. My mother Valerie smoothed her dress and put on her best camera-ready smile, anticipating a public display of my total submission. Preston and Jasmine followed a few paces behind me, taking their places at the center table reserved for the guests of honor. They were ready to be worshipped. I stepped up to the microphone and gently tapped the metal grill. A soft electronic hum echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system, causing the string quartet to immediately stop playing. The hundreds of guests in the grand solarium slowly quieted down, turning their attention to the stage. The clinking of crystal champagne glasses ceased. The murmurs of Potomac society and the condescending whispers of Preston's Boston relatives faded into complete silence. I looked out over the sea of expensive suits and custom designer gowns. I saw the faces of the people who had judged me, overlooked me, and bought into my parents' fake narrative. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began, my voice echoing clear and steady across the massive room. "We are gathered here to celebrate the third anniversary of my sister Jasmine and her husband Preston. My parents, Valerie and Roland, have always taught me the absolute importance of family legacy. They taught me that maintaining a pristine public image is the single most important investment a family can make. They taught me that pedigree and historical wealth are the ultimate measures of a person's true value. So tonight, I wanted to present a special visual tribute to honor the exact legacy that Preston brings to our family. I wanted to show everyone here the absolute truth about the man my parents sacrificed everything to impress. I reached into my velvet clutch and pulled out my encrypted tablet. I pressed a single button on the smooth glass screen. The lights in the grand solarium immediately dimmed to a dramatic low glow. Behind me, 3 massive high-definition projection screens descended silently from the vaulted glass ceiling. The crowd let out a collective murmur of anticipation, expecting a romantic montage of wedding photos and happy vacations. Instead, the screens flared to life with blindingly bright, stark white financial documents. They were 30 feet tall and absolutely impossible to ignore. I watched the confusion ripple through the room as the wealthy guests squinted to read the massive text. "What you are looking at, ladies and gentlemen," I announced into the microphone, "are the official sealed bankruptcy filings for Preston's entire Boston family." A collective gasp erupted from the upper terrace where Preston's relatives were standing. The older woman with the inherited pearls actually dropped her crystal glass, letting it shatter loudly against the floor. I swiped my finger across the tablet, and the screens instantly changed to display Preston's personal financial records. "And these," I continued, my voice projecting over the rising, shocked whispers of the crowd, "are Preston's personal debt statements. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in defaulted high-interest loans, maxed out secret credit cards, and outstanding markers at illegal underground poker rooms. He has absolutely zero assets and zero legitimate income. The luxurious lifestyle he and my sister have been flaunting in your faces for the past 3 years has been funded entirely by secretly draining my father's business accounts." The atmosphere in the room violently shifted from elegant celebration to absolute chaotic shock. Roland let out a strangled, choking sound, gripping the edge of his table as his peers turned to stare at him with wide, horrified eyes. Valerie clutched her chest, her face draining of all color as her meticulously crafted social standing completely disintegrated in real time. Jasmine stood up from her chair, her mouth hanging open in pure disbelief, shaking her head as she stared at the massive numbers, proving her husband was a complete generational fraud. Preston looked like a cornered animal, his arrogant smirk completely erased, replaced by sheer naked terror. He looked wildly toward the exits, but my security team was standing firm, blocking every single door. "But financial ruin is not the only legacy Preston brings to this marriage," I said, my voice cutting through the rising panic in the room like a sharpened blade. "True pedigree is also about loyalty and character, so let us look at Preston's character." I swiped the tablet one final time. The financial documents vanished, and crystal-clear high-definition surveillance video began playing across the 3 massive screens. The footage showed Preston walking into the lobby of a luxury boutique hotel in downtown Washington just 2 weeks ago. The camera angle was perfect, catching his face in bright afternoon light. A stunning blonde woman walked up to him, and he immediately pulled her into a passionate, intimate embrace. The crowd screamed. Jasmine let out a blood-curdling shriek of pure agony, covering her mouth with her hands. But the video was not done. The footage cut to the 2 of them laughing and drinking champagne on a private restaurant balcony. The screen split to show a close-up of the credit card Preston used to pay for the romantic getaway. It clearly displayed my father Roland's name. Preston was cheating on his wife using his father-in-law's money. And then I delivered the final devastating blow. I pointed directly to the back of the room where the event staff was coordinating the catering. For those of you wondering who the lovely woman in the video is, I announced calmly, she is actually here with us tonight. She is the high-end event planner who organized this very gala. Every head in the room swiveled to the back of the hall. The event planner, a woman who had been cheerfully directing the waitstaff all evening, froze in absolute terror as hundreds of angry, shocked eyes locked onto her. She dropped her clipboard and tried to run, but a massive security guard stepped into her path, refusing to let her escape the public humiliation she had helped orchestrate. Jasmine collapsed back into her chair, sobbing hysterically as her entire delusional fairy tale burned to ashes in front of her high society friends. Preston lunged toward the stage, his face red with manic rage, shouting at me to turn off the screens. He demanded that someone stop the video, but the audio track kicked in, playing his own voice, laughing with his mistress about how easy it was to fool his stupid rich in-laws. His own arrogant, cruel words echoed through the state-of-the-art surround sound system, washing over the crowd. The federal judges, the politicians, the doctors, they all heard the undeniable proof of his disgusting manipulation. The silence from earlier was completely gone, replaced by the deafening roar of a fake empire collapsing under the crushing weight of the absolute truth. I stood on the stage looking down at the wreckage I had just caused, feeling absolutely no remorse. The absolute chaos that consumed the Grand Solarium was deafening as the shock wore off and the raw panic set in. Valerie and Roland snapped out of their paralyzed state and immediately went into a furious defensive rage, unable to comprehend the total destruction of their social standing. My mother marched toward the edge of the elevated stage, her face twisted into a mask of pure visceral hatred. She pointed a trembling finger at me, screaming over the noise of the panicked crowd, accusing me of deliberately humiliating our family in front of the entire city. She demanded to know how I could be so incredibly cruel as to ruin my sister's special night with vicious, fabricated lies. My father Roland followed right behind her, his face a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He roared at the event staff to cut the power to the projection screens, but my private security detail physically blocked him from reaching the control room. He turned his fury back to me, bellowing that I was a psychotic monster who was officially dead to him, and that I would pay dearly for destroying his pristine reputation. Meanwhile, Preston's prestigious Boston relatives were in a state of absolute frantic meltdown. The older aunt who had scoffed at my mother earlier was practically hyperventilating, clutching her pearls as the reality of their public disgrace washed over her. The entire Boston cohort realized that their carefully hidden financial ruin and Preston's disgusting behavior had just been broadcast to the most powerful people in the capital. They wanted nothing more than to escape the suffocating humiliation of the room. They moved as a single terrified herd, pushing past the bewildered catering staff and abandoning their crystal champagne glasses on the floor as they rushed blindly toward the main exits. They pushed against the massive oak doors, desperately pulling at the brass handles to flee the venue and hide from the hundreds of judging eyes staring at them. The heavy oak doors did not budge a single inch. The Boston relatives pulled harder, panic rising in their throats as they realized the electronic locking mechanisms were completely engaged. Preston ran over to join them, slamming his shoulder against the solid wood, demanding that someone open the doors immediately. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the supposed elite society members rattled the handles like trapped animals in a cage. I stood comfortably on the stage, looking down at my frantic mother, my raging father, and the pathetic display happening at the exits. I leaned back into the microphone, and my voice echoed smoothly across the vaulted glass ceilings, instantly commanding the attention of every single person in the room. I calmly advised Preston's family to stop embarrassing themselves by pounding on the doors, because the security protocols were entirely under my direct control. Valerie glared at me, her chest heaving as she screamed that I had no right to hold them hostage and that she was going to have the venue management arrest me for this insane stunt. I looked down at my mother and let a cold, slow smile spread across my face. I told her that the venue management worked directly for me. I watched her face contort in confusion as the words slowly processed. I explained to the entire silent room that the Grand Solarium, the most exclusive and expensive event space in the district, belonged to an anonymous holding company. I told them that I was the sole owner and chief executive of that company. I owned the glass atrium. I owned the botanical gardens, and I owned the very doors they were desperately trying to break down. The $200,000 deposit my parents thought I had drained from my own meager savings to appease them was just money moving from my left pocket to my right pocket. The collective gasp that swept through the Potomac elite was intoxicating. Valerie stumbled backward, her legs suddenly unable to support the crushing weight of her own delusion. Roland stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that the daughter he had called a worthless failure was actually the supreme architect of this entire terrifying reality. I stepped down from the elevated stage holding a thick, heavy stack of manila folders in my hand. The sea of wealthy guests parted silently to let me through their eyes wide with morbid fascination as I walked slowly toward the center table where my parents and Jasmine were standing. Jasmine was still sobbing uncontrollably, her ruined makeup streaming down her face as she looked back and forth between me and her trapped, fraudulent husband. I stopped right in front of Roland and dropped the heavy stack of legal documents directly onto his pristine white table linen. I looked my father dead in the eye and told him that exposing Preston's infidelity was just a small piece of the actual presentation. I advised him to open the top folder. Roland reached out with trembling hands and flipped the cover open. His eyes scanned the first page and he let out a sharp, devastated gasp that sounded like a man drowning. Valerie leaned over to look at the paper, and her hands flew to her mouth to stifle a scream. I calmly explained to the room that to fund Jasmine's lavish lifestyle and pay for Preston's fake prestige, my father had secretly taken out a massive predatory secondary mortgage on their Potomac mansion. I told them that he had been skipping his commercial payments for months, desperately bleeding his business dry just to keep his arrogant son-in-law dressed in designer suits. I let that shameful truth sink into the minds of their wealthy friends who were currently watching their fake dynasty crumble into dust. Then I delivered the absolute final crushing blow. I explained that predatory lenders often sell off defaulted mortgages to larger private equity firms to recoup their losses. I told Roland that Apex Holdings, the massive commercial real estate firm that had been aggressively buying up distressed assets all over the city, had recently purchased his specific debt profile. I watched the light completely die in his eyes as he finally understood the magnitude of his ruin. I told him that I was the anonymous CEO of Apex Holdings. I owned his debt. I owned his massive hidden liabilities. And because he had missed 3 consecutive payments to buy luxury cars and country club memberships for a man who was actively cheating on his golden child, I was officially foreclosing on their Potomac mansion. The legal notices were sitting right there on the table, effectively rendering them completely homeless and entirely bankrupt. The sheer poetic justice of the moment hung heavily in the dead, silent room. I watched my mother physically collapse against the table, completely unable to process that her desperate social climbing had resulted in absolute poverty. They had sacrificed me to protect their wealth, and in the end, I was the one who bought their entire world just to burn it down. The reality of the foreclosure and the total financial ruin of my parents finally penetrated Preston's thick, arrogant skull. He realized that the unlimited bank account he had married into was completely empty, and the massive debt he had accumulated was about to crash down on his own head. He stopped banging on the locked oak doors and turned back toward the center of the room. His face was twisted in a mixture of blind panic and absolute disgust as he looked at Jasmine. She was still sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, amidst the scattered legal documents, her expensive custom-beaded gown pooling around her in a pathetic, messy pile. Preston did not rush to comfort his wife. He did not offer a single word of reassurance or support. Instead, he marched straight up to the table, his expensive shoes crunching over broken champagne glass, and told Jasmine that he was contacting his lawyers in the morning to file for an immediate divorce. He loudly declared that he refused to be legally tied to a bankrupt family of frauds and that he was leaving her with absolutely nothing. Jasmine let out a guttural, agonizing scream, grabbing at the hem of his tailored trousers, begging him not to leave her alone in the wreckage. She cried that they could fix this, that they could still be high society royalty. But Preston just violently kicked his leg free from her grasp and walked away, leaving the golden child completely abandoned and utterly broken in front of the entire Potomac elite. Seeing their prized son-in-law demand a divorce and watching their social standing evaporate into thin air completely broke my parents' remaining sanity. The fierce pride and the suffocating arrogance that had defined their entire existence completely melted away, leaving behind two pathetic, terrified strangers. Valerie and Roland, the supreme monarchs of Potomac society, literally dropped to their heavy knees on the cold marble floor right in front of me. My mother reached out with shaking hands, grasping at the delicate fabric of my midnight blue gown, her tears ruining her expensive makeup and staining her face with dark streaks of mascara. She looked up at me with wide, desperate eyes and started begging for mercy like a cornered animal. "Aaliyah, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her utter humiliation. "You cannot do this to us. We are your parents. We gave you life. We made a terrible mistake, but we are a family. You have to save us from this nightmare. You have the money to make all of this go away. Please just cancel the foreclosure and pay off the terrible debt. We will do anything you want. We will give you whatever you ask for, just please do not let us lose our home and our precious reputation." Roland joined in right beside her, his broad shoulders shaking violently as he openly wept in front of the very federal judges and wealthy business owners he had spent decades trying to impress. He pleaded with me, saying that the commercial market had been too tough and that he only took out those toxic secondary loans because he was trying to give Jasmine the beautiful life she deeply deserved. He begged me to remember the good times we had when I was a child, before all the money and the crushing expectations ruined everything between us. He promised that if I just forgave the massive debt and bailed out his failing accounting firm, he would publicly acknowledge me as his most successful child and the true rightful heir to the family legacy. They were literally groveling at the feet of the exact daughter they had so callously discarded, throwing away every last ounce of their dignity just to save their artificial collapsing kingdom. I stood there looking down at the two people who had created me, watching them completely fall apart in front of the entire city. I did not feel a single drop of pity for them. I did not feel any sudden urge to be the bigger person or to rescue them from the very raging fire they had deliberately started. I looked at my mother, seeing the exact same face that had stared back at me 3 years ago in her pristine living room when I was the one desperately begging for my literal survival. I remembered the cold, calculating emptiness in her eyes when she sipped her imported Earl Grey tea and watched me drown in my own terror. I slowly pulled the fabric of my dress out of her frantic, sweaty grip and took a deliberate, measured step back, distancing myself from their toxic, clinging desperation. I looked down at my mother and my father, looking deep into their terrified, broken souls, and I repeated the exact words they had burned into my memory. I told them that I do not throw money out the window for failures. I told them that they do not deserve any help. The words hit Valerie like a brutal physical strike to the chest. She stopped crying instantly and just stared up at me, her mouth opening and closing silently as the profound, devastating karma of the moment finally washed over her entire being. She remembered saying those exact words to me. She remembered the cruelty she had inflicted, and she realized that the universe had just returned it to her, multiplied by a massive, relentless magnitude. Roland buried his face in his trembling hands, sobbing loudly into the cold marble floor, completely broken by the reality that his own horrific parenting had sealed his ultimate doom. They had taught me that harsh actions have brutal consequences, and now they were choking on the bitter, toxic harvest of their own terrible seeds. I did not say another word to them. I turned my back on my weeping parents and my hysterical sister, leaving them to wallow forever in the miserable wreckage of their destroyed lives. I looked up at the glass control room and gave my security chief a final defining nod. The heavy oak doors of the grand solarium simultaneously unlocked with a loud, satisfying mechanical click. The terrified Boston relatives and the shocked Potomac elite immediately scrambled through the open exits, desperate to escape the toxic radioactive fallout of my family. I walked slowly through the center of the massive glass atrium, my posture perfectly straight and my head held high in absolute triumph. The remaining guests parted silently to let me pass, no one daring to say a single word to the powerful woman who had just orchestrated the most spectacular public execution in the history of the district. I stepped out of the grand solarium and out into the cool, refreshing night air. The heavy rain had finally stopped, and the dark sky was beginning to clear, revealing the faint, beautiful glow of the stars above the capital city. My loyal chauffeur was waiting patiently by the open door of my sleek black Maybach, surrounded by my elite security team. I slid into the luxurious leather seat, and the heavy car door closed behind me, shutting out the noise and the chaos of the painful past completely. The powerful engine purred to life, and we pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the bright venue and the toxic ruins of my biological family far behind in the fading rearview mirror. I leaned back against the plush, soft leather and looked out the tinted window at the passing, glowing city lights. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting the quiet hum of the luxury vehicle soothe my mind. There would be no more desperate phone calls, no more fake olive branches, and no more begging for validation. My shadow empire was entirely mine to control, and no one would ever take it from me. I had originally entered that building as a forgotten ghost from their miserable past, but I was leaving it as the undisputed architect of my own brilliant future. The heavy, suffocating chains of their endless expectations and their cruel, conditional love were permanently shattered into a million pieces. They were going to spend the rest of their miserable, pathetic lives drowning in deep bankruptcy and bitter, endless regret, while I was moving rapidly forward into a vast world of infinite possibility and absolute lasting peace. I was completely and entirely free. The ultimate lesson from this story is that your worth is never defined by the conditional love of a toxic family. When those who should protect you abandon you for superficial status, it reveals their brokenness, not your failure. True power lies in radical self-reliance and the courage to walk away from environments that demand you to shrink. By channeling the profound pain of betrayal into relentless determination, you can forge an unbreakable empire. Ultimate freedom is realizing you no longer need a seat at their table when you possess the strength and vision to buy the entire building. Drop a comment below to share how you found the strength to cut toxic ties and build your own success, and hit that subscribe button for more empowering stories of resilience and redemption.